The flames licked hungrily at the wooden beams of the barn, casting a hellish glow across the Montana night. Mason Caldwell stood frozen at the edge of the Harper property, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing inferno before him. The heat pressed against his skin like a physical force, awakening memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Mason's hands trembled not from fear of what lay ahead, but from the demons that clawed at his mind. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. His breath came in shallow gasps as the crackling roar of the fire transported him back to another time, another burning building filled with screams. A desperate cry pierced through the roar of the flames, snapping him back to the present. Someone was still alive in there. Mason's feet moved before his mind could protest. Each step toward the burning barn was a battle against every instinct in his body. The wooden structure groaned under the assault of the flames, timbers creaking in warning of imminent collapse. He reached the main doors, finding them secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Not an accident, someone had locked this barn deliberately with someone inside. The realization sent a chill through him, despite the blistering heat. Mason took 3 steps back, drew a deep breath that scorched his lungs, and charged. His shoulder connected with the door, pain shooting through his side. The wood splintered, but held. Gritting his teeth, he backed up again and delivered a powerful kick just beside the lock. The aged wood cracked. Another kick, and the doors burst open. A wall of heat and smoke rushed to meet him, driving him back momentarily. Mason pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, squinting through the thick smoke. The interior was a maze of flame and shadow support beams already beginning to fall. Through the smoke, he made out a figure slumped against a center post, a woman with dark auburn hair matted against her face. Her wrists were bound to the post with a heavy iron chain, the metal glowing red where it pressed against her skin. Her head hung forward unconscious, but a slight movement of her chest showed she still breathed. "I've got you," Mason muttered, though he doubted she could hear. He knelt beside her, pulling his knife from his belt. The chain was secured with a padlock, no key in sight. Mason examined the post instead, old wood already weakened by the fire. He braced himself against it and pushed with all his strength. The wood groaned, splintered, and finally gave way enough for the chain to slip free from the top. Mason gathered the woman into his arms, her body limp as he carried her through the smoke and debris. A support beam crashed down just feet away, sending up a shower of sparks. Mason felt the heat sear his left arm, but didn't slow. 3 more steps, then they burst through the doorway into the blessed coolness of the night air. He carried her several yards before his legs gave out. Mason sank to his knees, checking her pulse, weak but steady. Her face, smudged with soot, was young, mid-20s, perhaps, with delicate features and a small scar near her right temple. As he laid her gently on the ground, Mason sensed movement at the edge of his vision. Turning sharply, he caught sight of a figure standing at the tree line, watching. A tall man in a dark coat, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Their eyes met across the distance, and Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The man watched for a long, deliberate moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness of the pines. Mason gathered the unconscious woman up again and whistled sharply. From the darkness, a large dog with mottled gray and white fur emerged, one eye milky white from an old injury. "Homeboy," Mason commanded, and the dog led the way across the darkened field toward his cabin. 1 hour earlier, Mason had been sitting at his small wooden table grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. His cabin was illuminated by no fewer than 7 oil lamps, all burning low, but collectively casting enough light to banish any shadow. Conspicuously absent was a fireplace instead, a small iron stove with its door firmly shut, served for cooking, and what little heat was needed in the mild spring evening. The cabin itself was Spartan, but meticulously organized. A narrow bed against one wall, a bookshelf lined with medical texts and a few dog-eared novels, a trunk at the foot of the bed. The walls were bare, save for a single framed document, its text illegible from across the room. Ranger lay near the door, his one good eye occasionally flicking toward his master. The dog suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Mason paused his work, listening. At first there was only the familiar symphony of night sounds. Then he caught at the faint scent of smoke too strong to be from his carefully controlled stove. Moving to the window, Mason peered out into the darkness. Over the ridge where the Harper property lay, an orange glow illuminated the night sky. Fire. His heart stammered in his chest. Mason's hand went reflexively to the thin silver chain at his neck, fingers closing around the small pendant hidden beneath his shirt. His breathing quickened. Unbidden images flashed before his eyes as burning canvas tents, screaming men strapped to beds, the choking black smoke that made every breath agony. For a moment he was paralyzed, caught between present and past. The orange glow pulsed on the horizon like a malevolent heartbeat. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be trapped. Someone could be burning alive while he stood frozen by his own demons. Mason closed his eyes, drew a shaky breath. "Not again," he whispered to the empty room. "Not if I can help it." With mechanical efficiency, Mason gathered his medical bag, a canteen of fresh water, clean bandages, and burn salve. He strapped on his holster, checking that his Remington revolver was loaded before heading out the door, Ranger at his heels. Now making his way back to his cabin with the unconscious woman in his arms, Mason's mind worked methodically through what needed to be done. The burns at her wrists required immediate attention. Smoke inhalation would need monitoring. She was dehydrated and possibly concussed. Ranger pushed open the cabin door with his nose, and Mason carried Victoria inside, laying her carefully on his bed. The burns circled both wrists where the hot metal had seared into her flesh, second degree, at least angry red with blisters already forming. Working quickly, Mason gathered clean water, soft cloths, and the burn salve he'd prepared from plantain leaves, honey, and lavender oil. He gently cleaned the soot from her face and carefully applied salve to her wrists, then wrapped them in the softest bandages he had. Throughout his ministrations, Mason maintained a clinical detachment, focusing on the injuries rather than the person. It was how he'd survived as a field nurse during the war, seeing wounds, not men. Yet something about this woman's vulnerability stirred something he'd thought long buried. Ranger settled on the floor beside the bed, his one good eye fixed on the woman's face. The dog's unusual attentiveness caught Mason's notice. "What do you make of her, boy?" Mason murmured, resting a hand on the dog's head. As if in answer, the woman's lips moved slightly, a whisper so faint Mason nearly missed it. "The cellar, the box. Don't let them know." Mason leaned closer. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her next words were slurred but distinct. "Father, hide it." Then she stilled again, her breathing settling into a more regular rhythm. Mason straightened, considering her cryptic words. Cellar, box, father. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but they hinted at why someone had tried to burn her alive in that barn. He glanced toward the window, where the glow of the fire was still visible on the horizon. There might be others in danger. There might be answers. "Watch her," he instructed Ranger, gathering his hat and gun. "I'll be back by dawn." The Harper homestead was quiet now, the barn reduced to smoldering ruins. The main house stood dark and silent, its windows reflecting the dying glow of embers. Mason approached cautiously, Ranger padding silently beside him. The morning sun had just begun to lighten the eastern sky. The front door hung slightly ajar. Drawing his revolver, Mason pushed it fully open with the toe of his boot. The interior was undisturbed but eerily empty. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, half full and long cold. A book lay open on an armchair, a pair of reading glasses folded neatly atop it. No signs of struggle or hasty departure, just the unsettling quiet of a home whose occupants had vanished. Mason knew Edward Harper only slightly, a serious, educated man who'd moved to the territory 3 years ago with his daughter. They kept mostly to themselves. Harper occasionally trading books with Mason when their paths crossed in town. Moving through the house, Mason looked for any clue to what had happened. In Harper's study, he found papers scattered across a desk, a drawer hanging open. Someone had searched here and recently. Among the papers, a land deed caught his eye, the Harper property, 150 acres of seemingly ordinary Montana terrain. Behind the house stood a storage shed, and its door secured with a heavy padlock. Mason examined it, then moved to a window, wiping away dust to peer inside. His blood ran cold at what he saw. Edward Harper sat slumped in a chair, his hands bound behind him, a dark stain of dried blood surrounding a neat hole in his forehead. Execution style. Mason broke the window with the butt of his revolver and climbed inside. The smell hit him immediately, the unmistakable copper scent of death. Harper had been dead at least a day, his body already stiffening in the cool air of the shed. "What did you get yourself into?" "Harper," Mason murmured, examining the bindings on the dead man's wrists. professional work, tight, efficient knots that wouldn't loosen no matter how the victim struggled. As he moved around the body, Mason's boot struck something hollow beneath the plank floor. Kneeling, he found a loose board that slid aside to reveal a hidden compartment. Within it was a trapdoor leading downward. Mason descended the narrow ladder into darkness. At the bottom, he struck a match illuminating a small cellar that had been converted into what appeared to be a geological laboratory. Shelves lined the walls holding rock samples, each meticulously labeled. A work table dominated the center of the space, covered with papers, measuring tools, and several magnifying glasses. Among the scattered papers on the table, Mason found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn from frequent handling. Opening it, he found pages of neat handwriting, diagrams, calculations. Harper had been methodically documenting his findings about something he referred to only as the luminous mineral. Tucked between the pages was a small, silver-inlaid tin box. Inside lay a chunk of unremarkable grayish stone and a folded letter from a Professor Williams at Columbia University. The letter confirmed Harper's discovery of an element called uranium, with remarkable energy properties beyond anything currently known to science. Mason carefully replaced the letter and examined the rock sample again. This unremarkable stone had gotten Edward Harper killed and nearly cost his daughter her life. A sudden noise from above, a board creaking, sent Mason's hand to his revolver. He quickly pocketed the small box and moved silently to the ladder. Listening intently, he heard nothing further, but his instincts screamed danger. Mason ascended carefully, emerging into the shed with his gun drawn. The space was empty save for Harper's body, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He slipped out the door, scanning the property. The sun had fully risen now, illuminating the devastation of the burned barn. In the daylight, Mason spotted something he'd missed in the darkness, a set of hoof prints leading away from the barn toward the main road. At least 3 horses, maybe more. Whatever had happened here wasn't over. And the young woman in his cabin, Harper's daughter, he presumed was the only living witness. Victoria Harper drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of memory flashing behind her closed eyelids. Her father's voice raised in anger. Unfamiliar men entering their home, rough hands binding her wrists, the suffocating heat and smoke as flames engulfed the barn around her. She remembered a face looming close, features sharp as a blade, eyes cold as Montana winter. "Tell me where it is," the man had demanded, his voice soft but menacing. "Tell me or burn like a witch." Now she sensed she was in an unfamiliar place. The air smelled of herbs and clean linen instead of smoke. She forced her eyes open, blinking against even the dim light of the room. She lay on a narrow bed in a small cabin. Oil lamps burned on nearly every surface, casting a steady glow that left no shadows. A man sat at a table across the room, his back to her, broad shoulders hunched as he worked with something she couldn't see. Panic surged through her. With a gasp, Victoria tried to sit up, only to be overcome by a fit of coughing that tore at her smoke-irritated lungs. The man turned at the sound, rising quickly but approaching slowly. He was tall, with the lean, weathered look of someone who lived by physical labor. His face was lined and tanned, framed by graying hair tied back at the nape of his neck. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a clear, startling blue that seemed at odds with his otherwise rugged appearance. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe here. Those lungs need time to clear." Victoria pressed herself against the wall, eyes darting around the cabin for anything that might serve as a weapon. Her gaze fell on an oil lamp beside the bed, and she reached for it with trembling hands. The man stopped his approach, raising his palms in a gesture of peace. "My name is Mason Caldwell. I found you in the burning barn at the Harper place. Brought you here to tend your injuries." Victoria's hands stilled on the lamp. "The Harper place," she echoed, her voice a ragged whisper. "My home." "You're Edward Harper's daughter, then?" She nodded slowly, wincing at the pain the movement caused in her head. "Victoria Harper." Her eyes widened suddenly. "My father, is he?" Mason's expression told her everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry, Miss Harper. I found him in the storage shed this morning. He's gone." Victoria closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. She had known, somehow had felt her father's absence like a physical wound, but hearing it confirmed made it unbearably real. "Who did this to you?" Mason asked gently. "Who locked you in that barn?" Victoria's eyes snapped open, fear replacing grief. "You don't know what you've gotten involved in, Mr. Caldwell. These men, they'll come for me. They'll come for you too now. What men? Why did they do this? But Victoria shook her head. I can't. It isn't safe. Her gaze fell on the oil lamps scattered throughout the cabin, and a tremor passed through her body. So many flames, she whispered. Mason followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. Without waiting for a response, he moved around the cabin, lowering the wicks on several lamps, until just 3 remained, lit, their flames barely larger than a candle's. Better, he asked, returning to stand a respectful distance from the bed. Victoria nodded slightly, surprise evident in her expression. Thank you. A large dog padded over to the bedside, its one good eye regarding her with intelligent interest. It sat, tail sweeping the floor in a tentative wag. That's Ranger, Mason explained. He doesn't usually take to strangers, but he seems to have appointed himself your guardian. Victoria cautiously extended her hand. Ranger sniffed it thoroughly, then rested his muzzle on the edge of the bed with a contented sigh. He was a herding dog before I found him. Mason continued, moving to the stove. Lost his eye protecting his flock from wolves. Seems he still has the instinct to protect. He poured something from a pot into a cup, the scent of herbs and honey filling the air. Willow bark tea, he explained, offering it to her, for the pain and inflammation. Victoria accepted the cup with bandaged hands, inhaling the steam before taking a cautious sip. The warmth spread through her chest, easing the raw feeling in her throat. You're a doctor, she asked. A shadow crossed Mason's face. I was a field nurse during the war. Nothing formal. Victoria studied him over the rim of her cup. You know your remedies. The salve on my wrist, plantain and honey. Mason raised an eyebrow, surprise. With lavender oil, you know herbal medicine? My mother was a nurse. She taught me before she died. I've read her books. Victoria set down the cup, her hands shaking with fatigue. Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your help, but you're in danger having me here. These men, they're looking for something my father discovered, something valuable. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way. The following days established a quiet routine. Mason tended Victoria's injuries with professional efficiency, changing bandages, applying fresh salve, monitoring her breathing for signs of improvement. Victoria, for her part, was a cooperative patient, following his instructions and slowly regaining her strength. She didn't speak much, especially at first. Mason didn't press her. He understood the need for silence after trauma, the difficulty of finding words for experiences that defied description. Instead, he filled the quiet with small practical matters, explanations of the herbs he used in her treatments, observations about the weather, news of the wild turkeys Ranger had flushed out near the creek. On the 4th morning, Mason returned from feeding his horses to find Victoria sitting up in bed, examining a medical text she'd taken from his bookshelf. Culpepper's Complete Herbal, she noted, not looking up as he entered. My mother had this same edition. It's comprehensive, Mason agreed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Though I've found some of his dosage recommendations need adjusting for different constitutions. Victoria closed the book, setting it aside. You've been using meadow saffron in the salve for the inflammation. Mason nodded, impressed by her observation. Combined with the plantain, it speeds healing. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My mother would have approved. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Mr. Caldwell, I need to ask you something. Mason pulled a chair closer, sitting down. Go ahead. These men who killed my father, who tried to kill me, they won't stop looking. Victoria's voice was stronger today, the rasping quality gradually fading. Why are you risking yourself for me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Mason considered her question, his blue eyes thoughtful. During the war, he began slowly, I treated hundreds of men, young boys, most of them scared and in pain. I couldn't save them all. No one could have. His hand moved unconsciously to the silver chain at his neck. But that didn't stop me from trying every time. The war ended a decade ago, Victoria pointed out gently. Some wars don't end when the fighting stops. Mason's gaze drifted to the window, to the vast Montana landscape beyond. Sometimes they follow you, become part of who you are. Victoria studied him, seeing beyond the weathered exterior to the complexity beneath. This man carried burdens she could only guess at, yet he'd taken on hers without hesitation. I think I understand, she said softly. Thank you. Mason nodded once, acknowledging her gratitude without requiring it. Your wrists need fresh bandages, he said, changing the subject. As he gathered his supplies, Victoria's gaze fell on the single-frame document hanging on the otherwise bare wall. From the bed, she could now make out enough to see it was a commendation from the Union Army Medical Corps dated 1863. You served at Gettysburg, she noted, nodding toward the frame. Mason's hands stilled momentarily. I did. The worst of the fighting. The field hospitals were overwhelmed. You know your history. Victoria shrugged slightly. My father was interested in the war, though he didn't serve. He subscribed to Harper's Weekly. They published accounts from the field hospitals. Mason brought the fresh bandages to the bedside, gently unwrapping the old ones from her wrists. The papers couldn't capture the reality, he said quietly. The sounds, the smells, the impossible choices. They fell into silence as Mason worked his touch, clinical but gentle. Victoria watched his hands, strong, capable hands that moved with the precision of long practice. These same hands had pulled her from fire, had tended her wounds, had possibly saved her life. On the fifth day, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. Victoria sat at the small table, her strength returning enough for short periods out of bed. She was writing in a small notebook Mason had given her, documenting what she remembered of her father's research from memory. Storm's coming, Mason observed, hanging his damp hat by the door. Ranger's been anxious all morning. As if confirming his words, the dog paced restlessly near the window, occasionally emitting a low whine. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the tall pines that surrounded the cabin. I've always loved storms, Victoria said, setting down her pencil. The power of them. The way they clear the air afterward. She glanced toward the nearest oil lamp, its flame steady despite the draft from the window. Fire, though, that's different. Fire only destroys. Mason busied himself preparing coffee. Not always, he said after a moment. Fire cauterizes wounds. It purifies water. It keeps us warm in winter. When it's controlled, Victoria amended, when it serves rather than consumes. Like most powerful things, Mason agreed, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. It's the intention behind the use that matters. He brought her a cup, and Victoria accepted it with hands that were steadier, now the burns on her wrists healing cleanly beneath his care. Is that why you have so many lamps but no fireplace? She asked. To control the fire, keep it small. Mason's expression revealed nothing, but he didn't deny her observation. Light without heat, he said simply. It serves its purpose. The sky darkened rapidly as the storm approached. Rain began to patter against the cabin roof softly at first, then with increasing intensity. Mason moved around the cabin, checking that the windows were secure. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead. Victoria flinched, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup. Ranger pressed closer to her, trembling slightly. It's right on top of us, Mason observed, glancing at Victoria. You all right? She nodded, but her knuckles were white around her cup. Another flash, another immediate boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Victoria set down her cup with a sharp clink, her breathing quickening. The next lightning strike hit something nearby, the thunder so loud it was more felt than heard. Victoria gasped, pushing back from the table so violently her chair toppled. She pressed herself against the wall, arms wrapped around her middle, eyes squeezed shut. Not the barn, she whispered. Please, not again. Mason understood immediately the storm had triggered memories of the fire of being trapped as flames closed in around her. He moved slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady. Victoria, you're safe. You're in my cabin. The storm can't hurt you. She didn't seem to hear him, lost in the grip of memory. They're going to let me burn, she whispered. They're going to watch me burn like they watched Father die. Mason didn't approach, didn't touch her. Instead, he sat on the floor a few feet away, legs crossed, hands visible, and open on his knees. I'm right here, he said softly. I won't let anyone hurt you. Focus on my voice, Victoria, just my voice. Thunder rolled again, but more distant now. Rain hammered on the roof, a steady, almost musical patter. Ranger moved from Victoria to Mason, then back again, whining softly in confusion. That's right, boy, Mason encouraged. She needs you right now. The dog settled beside Victoria's feet, his warm weight a solid anchor to the present moment. Mason remained where he was, patient, unthreatening. When I was a boy, he began, his voice low and steady. My father taught me to count between the lightning and the thunder. Each second is about a mile of distance. When the storm is right overhead, there's no gap at all. Victoria's eyes opened slightly, focusing on him through a haze of memory and fear. The thunder is already moving away, Mason continued. Count with me next time. As if on cue, another flash illuminated the cabin. 1, 2, 3, Mason counted steadily. Victoria's lips moved silently, counting with him. The thunder rumbled noticeably farther away. 3 seconds, Mason noted. 3 miles. The storm is passing. Victoria's breathing slowed, her arms relaxing slightly from their tight grip around her middle. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know what happened. No need for apologies, Mason assured her. The mind has its own ways of protecting itself. Sometimes that means taking us back to places we'd rather not go. Victoria studied him, really seeing him now, rather than the phantoms of her memory. You know about this. From the war. Mason nodded slightly. And after. There were nights when every shadow held an enemy, when every loud noise was cannon fire. He held her gaze steadily. It gets better. Not gone, perhaps, but manageable. How? Victoria asked, genuine need in her voice. Mason considered his words carefully. By acknowledging it, by not running from it. His hand moved unconsciously to the chain at his neck. Sometimes we can't outrun what haunts us. We can only learn to live alongside it. Victoria sank down to sit on the floor, her back still against the wall, but her posture less defensive now. The fire, she said softly. It wasn't just the barn. When I was 7, our first home burned down. I was trapped in my bedroom until my father broke through the window from outside. She rubbed absently at a small scar near her hairline. I've been afraid of fire ever since. And yet you lived on a ranch with oil lamps, a fireplace, a wood stove, Mason observed. You faced your fear daily. I had no choice, Victoria replied simply. One can't avoid fire entirely, not out here. No, Mason agreed. One can't. They sat in silence for a time, the storm moving steadily eastward, the gaps between lightning and thunder lengthening. Victoria's breathing returned to normal, the panic receding from her eyes. Thank you, she said finally, for understanding, for not, she gestured vaguely, making it worse. Mason nodded once, acknowledging her gratitude without requiring it. There's fresh coffee on the stove when you're ready, he said, rising smoothly to his feet. And I think Ranger would appreciate it if you told him the storm is nearly over. He takes his cues from humans. Victoria managed a small smile, scratching behind the dog's ears. It's all right now, boy, she murmured. We're both safe here. As she spoke those words, Victoria realized with mild surprise that she meant them. Despite everything, her father's murder, her own near death, the men who might still be searching for her, she did feel safe in this cabin, with this quiet, perceptive man who understood trauma because he carried his own. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed the world clean. Mason rose early as usual, moving quietly about the cabin to avoid waking Victoria. He had just set water to boil for coffee when a sound outside caught his attention, hoofbeats approaching at a measured pace. Motioning for Ranger to stay quiet, Mason slipped his revolver from its holster and moved to the window. 2 riders approached along the main trail. The lead rider was a large man on an expensive-looking bay horse, dressed in a tailored suit and wide-brimmed hat that marked him as no ordinary rancher. Behind him rode a leaner figure in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a long scar that pulled at his right eye. Mason glanced toward Victoria, still sleeping on the bed across the room. If these men were who he suspected, he couldn't let them see her. Moving swiftly but silently, Mason crossed to the bed and gently covered Victoria with an extra blanket, obscuring her form. Don't move, he whispered when her eyes fluttered open in confusion. Visitors, stay quiet. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by fear, but she nodded once and remained still beneath the blanket. Mason positioned himself by the door, revolver ready, but not visibly threatening, and waited for the inevitable knock. It came moments later, 3 confident raps. Mason opened the door, partway blocking the entrance with his body, while keeping his gun hand hidden from view. Good morning, the larger man greeted with a smile that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. I apologize for the early call. Are you Mason Caldwell? I am. Mason confirmed, his expression neutral. And you are Cornelius Black, director of the Rocky Mountain Mining Company. He gestured to his companion. My associate, Silas Reed. The scarred man nodded curtly, his gaze moving past Mason to survey what little of the cabin interior was visible from his position. "What brings the Rocky Mountain Mining Company to my door at dawn?" Mason asked, maintaining his position in the doorway. Black's smile widened all teeth and no warmth. "Business, Mr. Caldwell. Potentially profitable business for both of us." He glanced pointedly at the door Mason was blocking. "Might we come in to discuss it?" "I prefer to conduct unexpected business outside," Mason replied evenly. "The morning air is favorable for clear thinking." A flicker of annoyance crossed Black's face, but he quickly masked it with another smile. "As you wish." He dismounted with surprising grace for a man his size, handing his reins to Reed, who remained on horseback. "I'll be direct, Mr. Caldwell. My company is expanding operations in this region. Your property is strategically located for our purposes. I'm prepared to offer a very generous price, 3 times its assessed value." Mason leaned against the doorframe, affecting a casual posture that belied his inner alertness. "This land isn't for sale, Mr. Black, but I appreciate the interest." Black studied Mason with new interest, as if reassessing his initial judgment. "Nevertheless, I encourage you to review our offer formally. Take a few days to consider." He reached into his jacket, producing a folded document, which he held out to Mason. Mason accepted the paper without looking at it. "Was there something else? You seem to have ridden quite a distance just to deliver a land offer." Black hesitated, then nodded. "Actually, yes. We're also looking for information about our neighbors, the Harpers." His eyes searched Mason's face for any reaction. "There was a tragic fire at their property a few days ago. Edward Harper's body was found, but his daughter Victoria is missing. As their nearest neighbor, I wondered if you might have seen her." From her hidden position on the bed, Victoria tensed beneath the blanket, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the men outside would hear it. These were the men who had murdered her father, who had chained her in that barn and left her to burn. Mason's expression revealed nothing. "I saw the fire," he acknowledged. "Went to check the next morning, found no survivors." He shook his head regretfully. "Terrible business. Harper was a decent man." Black nodded solemnly, though his eyes remained cold. "Indeed. A terrible accident." "Accident?" Mason raised an eyebrow. "With Harper shot through the forehead and his daughter chained in a burning barn. That's quite an accident, Mr. Black." The atmosphere changed instantly. Black's false congeniality vanished, replaced by calculating assessment. Reed's hand moved subtly toward his holstered weapon. "You found the girl," Black said softly. "Is she inside?" Mason didn't move, didn't blink. "I found a body in the barn burned beyond recognition. Assumed it was the daughter. If you know differently, perhaps you should explain how." Black's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Caldwell. If you found Victoria Harper alive, you're harboring the only witness to a crime. That makes you an accessory." "To murder?" Mason asked mildly. "Interesting confession, Mr. Black." Reed's hand now rested openly on his holstered gun. Black raised a placating hand toward his associate. "No need for that, Silas. Mr. Caldwell and I are just having a civil conversation." He turned his cold gaze back to Mason. "Let me be clear. If Victoria Harper survived that fire, she is in grave danger, not from me, but from the men who killed her father. Men who might believe she possesses certain information. I merely wish to ensure her safety." "Noble of you," Mason commented dryly. "But as I said, I found no survivors." Black studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I see. Well, should you happen to hear anything about Miss Harper, I hope you'll contact me immediately. For her own protection, of course." He reached into his vest pocket, extracting a silver calling card. "My office is in Helena, but I'll be staying at the Brown Hotel in town for the next week." Mason accepted the card with the same indifference he'd shown the land offer. "I'll keep that in mind." Black smiled all teeth again. "Please do, and consider my offer for your land. I'll expect your answer when I return in 1 week." He tipped his hat, the gesture almost mocking. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." As Black remounted his horse, his gaze swept once more over the cabin. "Interesting place you have here. So many lamps, yet no proper fireplace. One might think you had an aversion to real fire." Mason's expression remained impassive. "One might think many things, Mr. Black. Good day." He remained in the doorway, watching as the two men rode away, waiting until they disappeared from view before closing the door and moving quickly to Victoria's side. She pushed back the blanket, her face pale with fear and anger. "That was him," she whispered. "Black, he's the one who ordered my father killed, who ordered me chained in the barn." Mason nodded, helping her sit up. "I thought as much. He's looking for you, and he's not being particularly subtle about it." "He threatened you," Victoria noted, her voice shaking slightly. "Just for possibly knowing me." "Men like Black always threaten," Mason replied, checking the windows to ensure the riders were truly gone. "It's the only language they speak fluently." Victoria's gaze fell on the land offer Black had left, now lying on the table. "He wants your land too." "Why, Tove?" Mason considered the question. "Your father found uranium on your property. Black probably suspects it extends to neighboring lands as well." "My father's maps," Victoria said with sudden realization. "They show the deposit extending at least a mile in each direction from our central claim. Your property would be part of it." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "That explains his persistence. But he doesn't strike me as a man who takes rejection well. He'll be back, and not alone." Victoria pushed herself up straighter, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her healing wrists. "Then we need to prepare. I won't let them hurt you because of me. They'd have to get through me first," Mason said, simply checking his revolver before returning it to its holster. "And I don't plan to make that easy for them." Victoria studied him, this quiet man who spoke of facing professional killers with such calm assurance. "You've done this before," she observed. "Stood against dangerous men, I mean." Mason's expression revealed nothing, but Victoria saw the way his hand moved unconsciously to the silver chain at his neck. "I've faced men who thought their cause justified any action, no matter how cruel," he said finally. "Black is no different, just better dressed." He moved to the stove, pouring the now boiled water into the coffee pot. "They'll return in a week, according to Black. That gives us time to strengthen your lungs, teach you to defend yourself, and prepare for whatever comes." "And if they come sooner," Mason glanced toward Ranger, who had stationed himself vigilantly by the window, "they won't catch us unaware. Ranger can smell trouble a mile off, and I sleep light." Victoria nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. "What about the town marshal? Could we send for him?" "Reynolds is in Helena for at least another week. Even if he returned early, he's one man against Black's resources." Mason brought her a cup of coffee. "No, our best option is to prepare here where we control the ground." As Victoria accepted the cup, her fingers brushed against Mason's. Despite the gravity of their situation, she felt a flutter of something unexpected, a connection that went beyond mere gratitude to her rescuer. "We'll face this together then," she said softly. Mason's eyes met hers, the clear blue holding something she couldn't quite name. "Together," he agreed, and for a moment the threat of Black and his men seemed less overwhelming. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the Montana wilderness, illuminating the vast landscape that men like Black sought to own and exploit. Inside the small cabins, two wounded souls who had each survived their own fires prepared to stand against the flames once more, this time side by side. The days following Black's visit brought a new urgency to Mason's cabin. Victoria's recovery accelerated, driven by necessity rather than natural healing. Each morning began with exercises to strengthen her lungs, deep breathing, controlled coughing, and gradually increasing physical activity. Each afternoon, Mason taught her to defend herself, how to shoot, where to strike if attacked, how to use the terrain to her advantage. "Aim for center mass," Mason instructed, adjusting her grip on his Remington revolver. They stood behind the cabin, 6 bottles arranged on a fallen log 20 yards away. "Don't try to be fancy, just hit what you're aiming at." Victoria steadied her breath, raised the gun with both hands as he'd shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The bottle to the far left shattered glass glinting in the afternoon sun. "Good." Mason nodded, his expression betraying a hint of surprise. Again. 5 shots later, all 6 bottles lay shattered. Mason's eyebrow raised slightly as Victoria lowered the gun. "My father taught me to shoot," she explained, handing the revolver back to Mason. "Said a woman alone in this country should know how to protect herself." "Wise man," Mason commented, he reloading the weapon, "though I'm guessing he didn't expect you'd need the skill quite so desperately." Victoria's face clouded. "No, he believed knowledge was its own protection." She looked toward the distant mountains, her expression distant. He was wrong. Mason studied her profile against the backdrop of pines and blue sky. In the week since he'd pulled her from the burning barn, Victoria had transformed from a traumatized victim into something harder, more determined. The grief was still there, visible in the tightness around her eyes and the occasional distant gaze, but it now fueled a steely resolve rather than paralyzing her. Knowledge alone isn't enough, Mason agreed, tucking the revolver into its holster. But combined with preparation and will, it's a formidable force. He gestured toward the cabin. Let's check those wrists, then we'll go over the property boundaries again. Inside, Mason unwrapped the bandages from Victoria's wrists. The burns had healed remarkably well, the angry red replaced by tender, new skin, pink and fragile, but intact. His fingers were gentle as he applied fresh salve. You've got a healer's hands, Victoria observed, watching his methodical movements. Steady, certain. Mason's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Had plenty of practice. At Gettysburg, Victoria said, her eyes drifting to the framed commendation on the wall. Mason nodded once, not elaborating. His silence around his past had become familiar to Victoria, a boundary she respected but increasingly wondered about. These are healing well, Mason said, changing the subject as he secured fresh bandages. Another few days and you'll hardly need the wrappings. Victoria flexed her fingers experimentally. Still tight, but much better. She glanced toward the window, her expression growing serious. Black will return in 2 days. What's our plan? Mason moved to the table where he had laid out a rough map of the surrounding area. We prepare for the worst, but hope for something better. His finger traced the boundary of his property. They'll likely approach from the main trail again. It's the easiest route. But they might circle around through the eastern ridge if they're planning anything underhanded. When, Victoria corrected softly. Not if. Men like Black don't ask twice. Mason's blue eyes met hers, acknowledging the truth of her assessment. When, he agreed. Which is why we'll be ready either way. He showed her the defensive positions he'd established. Sight lines cleared, sheltered spots identified, escape routes planned. Victoria absorbed the information with the same intensity she'd shown studying his medical texts earlier in the week. You've done this before, she noted, not for the first time. Prepared for an attack. Mason rolled up the map, his movements precise. War teaches certain skills. They tend to stick. The war ended a decade ago, Victoria persisted gently. Yet you lived like a man, expecting battle any day. Mason turned away, busying himself at the stove. Force of habit. Victoria watched his back, the rigid set of his shoulders. Something in his posture, in the deliberate way he avoided her gaze, hinted at deeper waters than he was willing to reveal. Mason, she said softly, if we're facing this together, I should know who I'm standing beside. What haunts you may affect how you fight, how you react when Black returns. For a long moment, Mason remained motionless, his back to her hands braced on the edge of the stove. Then with a slow exhale, he turned. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of old pain. Fair enough, he conceded, but some stories aren't meant for daylight. After dark. Victoria accepted his terms with a nod, understanding instinctively that whatever Mason carried required the protective cloak of night to be revealed. As dusk settled over the Montana wilderness, Mason lit only 3 oil lamps, keeping them low as had become their custom. The cabin filled with gentle shadow, not dark enough to hide, but dim enough to soften hard edges, both physical and emotional. Victoria sat in the chair by the stove, a blanket around her shoulders despite the mild evening. Mason took the chair opposite Ranger, settling between them, as if sensing the gravity of what was to come. I was a field nurse with the Union Army, Mason began. Without preamble, his voice low but steady. Assigned to the Medical Corps at Gettysburg in '63, the casualties were overwhelming. 3 days of fighting, over 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. He paused, his gaze fixed on something distant. The field hospitals were little more than tents and tables. We worked day and night, amputating, stitching, bandaging. There was never enough morphine, never enough clean water, never enough hands. Victoria remained silent, giving him space to unfold his story at his own pace. On the second night, Mason continued, we received word that Confederate forces were approaching our position. The order came to evacuate the most critical patients to a more secure location, a farmhouse about a mile back from the lines. His hand moved unconsciously to the silver chain at his neck. We had to choose. Which men could be moved? Which men would stay? His voice remained steady, But Victoria could see the cost of that steadiness in the tightness around his eyes. I was put in charge of the triage. 17 men were deemed too critical to survive transport. I stayed with them while the others were evacuated. Mason's fingers closed around whatever hung from the chain hidden beneath his shirt. Just before midnight, artillery fire hit nearby. A shell landed close enough to damage one of the tent supports. A lantern fell. The canvas was dry, the weather hot. The fire spread within seconds. Victoria's breath caught, understanding dawning. The oil lamps, the absence of a fireplace, Mason's ability to overcome his fear long enough to save her from the burning barn. I tried to get them out, Mason said, his voice finally betraying a hint of emotion. The ones who could move at all, but most were strapped to beds heavily sedated or simply too weak. The smoke was overwhelming. He fell silent for a long moment. Victoria didn't press, didn't offer empty consolations. 3 days later, when I regained consciousness in a hospital in York, I was told none of the patients had survived. 17 men burned alive because I couldn't get them out in time. That wasn't your fault, Victoria said softly. Mason acknowledged her words with a slight nod, but his expression suggested the rational understanding had never fully penetrated his emotional guilt. There's more, he said quietly. The official report claimed negligence. That I'd improperly secured the lanterns, failed to maintain adequate safety measures. An investigation was launched. Victoria frowned. But surely in a war zone during active fighting, politics, Mason interrupted with a bitter half-smile. Someone higher up needed a scapegoat. Better to blame one field nurse than admit the evacuation order had come too late, that there weren't enough men or wagons to move all the wounded. What happened with the investigation? Mason's expression darkened. It was led by Captain Cornelius Black. Victoria's eyes widened. Black, the same man. The very same, Mason confirmed grimly. He was an officer with the Quartermaster Corps then, in charge of medical supplies for our sector. The pieces began to fall into place for Victoria. That's why you recognized his name when I first mentioned it. You knew him during the war. Mason nodded. Black conducted what passed for an investigation. Interviewed the surviving medical staff, examined the remains of the field hospital. His jaw tightened, but he had no interest in the truth. He needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. What happened? Victoria asked, dreading the answer. I was formally charged with negligence resulting in the deaths of 17 Union soldiers. Mason's voice was flat, emotionless now. The evidence against me was circumstantial, at best fabricated at worst. But with Black controlling the investigation, the outcome was predetermined. But you weren't executed or imprisoned, Victoria pointed out. The commendation on your wall. A week before my court-martial was to begin, new evidence emerged, Mason explained. A Confederate deserter came forward with information that artillery fire had been deliberately directed at our medical facilities that night. The fire wasn't my fault, it was an act of war. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out into the darkness. The charges were dropped. I received a commendation for bravery in attempting to save my patients and an honorable discharge due to injuries sustained in the fire. His hand touched his left arm where Victoria had noticed the old burn scar. But the damage was done. In the eyes of many, I was still the nurse who let 17 men burn to death. Victoria absorbed this revelation, connecting it to the man she'd come to know over the past week. A man who lived in isolation, who controlled fire with meticulous care, who'd run into a burning building despite his obvious fear. Is that why you live out here? She asked. To escape the whispers, Mason turned from the window. Partly. After the war, I tried to establish a practice in several towns, but the rumors always followed. That's the doctor who burned his patients alive. His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. Hard to build trust when people think you might kill them. So you came here where no one knew your story, where I could help those who needed it without the burden of reputation, Mason corrected. The homesteaders out here don't care about my past. They care if I can set a bone, deliver a baby, or treat fever. Victoria studied him in the lamplight, seeing him with new clarity, not just a man haunted by war, but a healer denied his calling by circumstances and politics. A man who still risked himself to save others despite everything he'd endured. And now Black has found you again, she said softly. Mason returned to his chair, his expression grim. Black doesn't recognize me. It's been 12 years, and I've changed considerably. But I recognized him immediately. Will you tell him when he returns? Mason considered the question. No, that history would only complicate matters. This is about you, your father, and whatever Black wants from that uranium deposit. My past with him is irrelevant. Victoria wasn't so certain. The coincidence of Black reappearing in Mason's life seemed too precise to be meaningless. But she respected Mason's decision. Thank you, she said simply, for telling me. Mason nodded once the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. We all have our ghosts, Victoria. The question is whether we let them control us or whether we learn to live alongside them. Victoria thought of her own ghost, her father's murder, the flames of the barn, the terror of being buried alive in fire. I'm trying to learn, she said softly. You're doing better than most, Mason assured her. He rose, moving toward his medical bag. Now there's something else we should discuss. Something about your father's discovery. Victoria straightened alert. This was the first time Mason had directly broached the subject of the uranium since their initial conversation. Mason retrieved the small, silver-inlaid tin box from his bag, placing it on the table between them. I've been thinking about this, about why Black wants it so badly and what your father understood that Black doesn't. The energy potential, Victoria supplied, Father believed it could revolutionize power generation someday. Yes, but there's more. Mason opened the box carefully, lifting out the letter from Professor Williams. The professor mentions energy properties beyond anything currently known to science. That suggests something specific, something your father had identified. Victoria reached for the notebook she'd been writing in, flipping to a diagram she'd recreated from memory. Father had been conducting experiments. He found that the uranium ore emitted some kind of energy, invisible but powerful. It could expose photographic plates even in complete darkness. Mason studied the diagram, his expression thoughtful. And he mapped the deposits on your land. Victoria nodded. The main vein runs northeast to southwest, extending at least a mile in each direction from the central point beneath our property. She hesitated. Mason, there is something else. Something I haven't told you. His blue eyes met hers, waiting. The map isn't just in my head, she admitted. Father created a detailed survey map with all the test sites marked. He hid it before Black's men came. Where? Victoria glanced toward the window as if concerned about unseen watchers. There's a box buried beneath the old oak at the north corner of our property. Watertight metal. It contains the map, Father's complete research notes, and samples from each test site. Mason absorbed this information, understanding its significance. That's what Black is really after. The complete research, not just the single sample. Yes, with it he could identify and claim every uranium deposit in the region. Victoria's expression hardened. Father wanted the discovery to benefit humanity, not line the pockets of men like Black. Mason closed the tin box thoughtfully. If Black doesn't get what he wants when he returns, he'll search our property, Victoria finished. He'll find the box eventually. Unless we find it first, Mason suggested. Victoria's eyes widened. You mean go back to the homestead? Before Black returns, Mason confirmed. Retrieve the box, secure your father's research. It's dangerous, Victoria protested. Black might have men watching the property. Possible, Mason acknowledged, but I know how to move unseen when necessary. He studied her face. It's your decision, your father's legacy. Victoria considered her fingers absently tracing the healing burns on her wrists. Mason watched her work through the decision, respecting her need to weigh the risks herself. Tomorrow night, she said finally, new moon, we'll have darkness on our side. Mason nodded once, approving her tactical thinking. We'll leave after sunset. The decision made, they moved to other preparations, checking supplies, planning routes, discussing contingencies. But beneath the practical conversation ran a new current of understanding between them, a deeper connection forged by shared confidences and common purpose. As Victoria finally retired to the bed, Mason taking his customary place in the chair by the window, she found herself watching him in the dim lamplight. This man, carrying wounds both visible and hidden, had become something unexpected in her life. Not just a rescuer or protector, but a partner in her fight for justice and survival. For the first time since her father's murder, Victoria felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came with Black's return, She would not face it alone. The following night arrived clear and moonless, perfect for their clandestine mission. Mason and Victoria prepared in near silence, communication reduced to essential words and gestures. Mason dressed entirely in dark clothing, his movements efficient as he checked his weapons, revolver at his hip, knife in his boot, another at his belt. Victoria wore Mason's spare clothes, too large but serviceable, her hair tucked under a dark cap. Remember, Mason instructed as he saddled the horses. If anything goes wrong, we separate and meet back at the cabin. If I'm not there by dawn, take Ranger and head for Marshal Sullivan's office in Helena. Victoria nodded, adjusting the revolver Mason had given her in its makeshift holster. I'm not leaving you behind. Mason paused in his work, meeting her gaze directly. This isn't negotiable, Victoria. Your father's research is what matters. It needs to reach the right hands, even if we don't. She wanted to argue but recognized the logic in his position. Fine, but nothing's going to go wrong. Mason's expression softened slightly. That's the spirit. They rode out as full darkness settled, Mason leading on his dappled gray gelding, Victoria following on the steadier chestnut mare. Ranger trotted alongside, his one good eye gleaming occasionally when it caught the starlight. They kept to the shadows of the tree line, avoiding the main trail, where possible, moving at a cautious pace that balanced speed with stealth. The journey to the Harper homestead took nearly an hour by this circuitous route. As they approached the burned remains of the barn, Victoria's posture stiffened, her hands tightening on the reins. Mason glanced back, checking her readiness. You all right? He asked quietly. Victoria nodded, though her face was pale in the starlight. Let's just get what we came for. They dismounted at the edge of the property, tethering the horses in a small copse of trees where they'd be hidden from casual observation. Mason surveyed the homestead through field glasses, scanning methodically for any sign of watchers. The main house stood dark and silent, its windows empty like blind eyes. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the night sky, a few charred beams still standing in mute testimony to the violence that had occurred there. The storage shed where Mason had found Edward Harper's body was now just a dark shape, its door hanging open. Looks clear, Mason murmured, lowering the glasses. But stay alert. We move fast. Get the box and go. Victoria led the way to the northern edge of the property, where an ancient oak spread its massive branches against the star-filled sky. Its size and age made it a natural landmark, one her father had chosen deliberately for its permanence. It's on the north side, she whispered, circling the massive trunk, buried between two large roots. Mason knelt, running his hands over the ground until he felt the distinctive shape of the roots Victoria had described. The earth between them had been disturbed relatively recently, though natural weathering had begun to mask the signs. Here, he confirmed, drawing his knife to loosen the soil. They worked quickly, taking turns digging with knife and hands until Mason's blade struck something solid about 2 feet down. Victoria's breath caught as he carefully excavated around the object, revealing a metal box roughly the size of a large book. That's it, she confirmed, helping to brush away the last of the soil. Mason lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than he expected, the metal cool against his hands. Victoria ran her fingers almost reverently across its surface. We did it, she whispered, a note of wonder in her voice. Father's work is safe. Not yet, Mason cautioned, glancing toward the dark homestead. Let's get back to the horses. As they rose to leave, Ranger suddenly stiffened, his hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Mason froze, signaling Victoria to silence. They listened, the night suddenly thick with tension. The soft sound of a horse snorting came from the direction of the main trail, too close to be their own mounts. Then the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Someone's here, Victoria breathed, barely audible. Mason tucked the metal box securely under his arm and drew his revolver with his free hand. Back to the horses. Different route. Stay low. They moved silently through the shadows paralleling the tree line, instead of returning the way they'd come. Mason led Victoria close behind Ranger, bringing up the rear with alert vigilance. They had nearly reached the copse where their horses waited when a voice called out from the darkness. That's far enough, folks. Mason pushed Victoria behind him, raising his revolver toward the voice. A man stepped from the shadows, his own gun aimed steadily at Mason's chest. Even in the darkness, the long scar pulling at his right eye was unmistakable, Silas Reed Black's associate. Evening, Caldwell. Reed greeted, his voice cold and professional. Didn't expect to find you here. though I can't say I'm surprised to see Miss Harper alive and well. His gaze shifted to Victoria, then to the metal box under Mason's arm. Mr. Black will be interested in what you're carrying. Mr. Black can go to hell, Mason replied evenly, his gun unwavering. Reed's thin lips curved in a humorless smile. He's sending the invitation to you first. He gestured with his gun. Drop the weapons, both of you. And if we refuse, Victoria asked, her own revolver now drawn and aimed at Reed. Then this gets messy, Reed answered simply, and Mr. Black doesn't get what he wants in one piece on ours. Mason assessed their options rapidly. Reed was a professional. His stance, his grip on his weapon, the cool calculation in his eyes all spoke of a man familiar with violent weapons. But he was also alone, at least for the moment. You're outnumbered, Reed. Us, Mason pointed out. 3 guns to 1. Reed's eyes flicked to Ranger, who stood beside Victoria with teeth bared. 2 guns and a mutt, he corrected, and I only need to hit one of you to change those odds. The standoff stretched tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Then from behind Reed, a new voice spoke. I believe the odds have just changed again. Reed stiffened his expression, flashing surprise before returning to careful neutrality. He didn't turn, keeping his gun trained on Mason. Marshal Sullivan, Reed acknowledged. This is a private matter. Frank Sullivan stepped into view, his badge gleaming dully against his dark coat. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with iron gray hair cut short beneath his hat. His revolver was aimed steadily at Reed's back. Threatening folks at gunpoint on private property seems mighty public to me, Sullivan observed mildly. His gaze shifted to Mason. Evening, Caldwell. Been a while. Mason nodded once, not lowering his weapon. Frank, good timing. Sullivan's attention returned to Reed. Now I suggest you lower that gun before the situation deteriorates further. For a tense moment, Reed seemed to consider his options. Then with deliberate slowness, he lowered his weapon. Wise choice, Sullivan approved. Now kick it over this way. Reed complied, his expression unreadable as the marshal collected his gun. What brings you out here so late, Marshal? Reed asked, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. Thought you were in Helena for circuit at court. Returned early, Sullivan replied simply. Got word of some unsavory business regarding the Harper property. His gaze shifted to Victoria. Miss Harper, I presume, heard you were dead. Reports of my death were exaggerated, Marshal. Victoria replied, still keeping her gun ready. Sullivan nodded, seemingly unsurprised. And that box you're holding, Caldwell, what might that be? Mason glanced at Victoria, letting her decide how much to reveal. My father's research, she answered after a moment's hesitation, on mineral deposits in the region. Mr. Black has shown considerable interest in acquiring it by any means necessary. Sullivan's weathered face remained impassive, but something sharpened in his gaze. Including murder and attempted murder. Yes, Victoria confirmed steadily. Sullivan considered this information, his gun never wavering from Reed. That's quite an accusation, Miss Harper. It's the truth, she stated simply. The marshal studied her face, then Mason's, then finally Reed's carefully neutral expression. I think we all need to continue this conversation somewhere more civilized. My office in town would do nicely. Mr. Black won't like that, Reed observed, his tone almost bored. Mr. Black isn't here, Sullivan countered. And until he is, you're coming with me to answer some questions about your presence on this property. Mason finally lowered his revolver slightly. How did you know to come here tonight, Frank? Sullivan's expression revealed nothing. Let's say I've been keeping an eye on the Harper situation. When I noticed unusual activity around a supposedly abandoned homestead, I thought I'd investigate. It wasn't a complete answer, and Mason knew it, but he accepted it with a nod. Our horses are just over in those trees. Good, Sullivan replied. You two head back to your place. I'll escort Mr. Reed to town and take a statement. Come by my office tomorrow afternoon. We'll sort this out properly. Victoria stepped forward, her posture tense. Marshal, this man works for Cornelius Black, who ordered my father murdered and tried to kill me as well. Are you sure it's wise to... I've been dealing with men like Reed for 30 years, Miss Harper. Sullivan interrupted gently. He'll reach my office safely, I assure you. Mason touched Victoria's arm lightly. Frank's good at his job, he said quietly, and we need to secure that box. After a moment's hesitation, Victoria nodded her agreement. Mason tucked the metal box more securely under his arm, his other hand still holding his revolver. Tomorrow afternoon, then, he confirmed to Sullivan. Watch your back, Frank. Black has resources. So do I, and the marshal replied with a tight smile. Now go on before anyone else decides to join our little gathering. Mason and Victoria retrieved their horses and mounted quickly, Ranger trotting ahead, as they set off toward Mason's cabin. Neither spoke until they were well away from the homestead, the silence of the Montana night enveloping them once more. Can we trust him? Victoria finally asked, her voice low, despite the distance they'd put between themselves and the others. Mason considered the question carefully. Sullivan's a good man. Known him since shortly after I settled here. If anyone can handle Reed and stand up to Black legally, it's him. But, Victoria prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in his tone. But Black has influence, Mason acknowledged. Money opens doors that badges can't always keep closed. Victoria glanced at the metal box secured to Mason's saddle. At least we have the research now. Father's work is safe. Mason nodded, though his expression remained troubled. We need to examine it tonight. Understand exactly what we're protecting before we meet with Sullivan tomorrow. They rode the rest of the way in watchful silence, both acutely aware that their successful retrieval of the box had escalated the situation with Black. Whatever tentative balance had existed before was now irrevocably altered. Black would know they had the research, and he would stop at nothing to obtain it. Back at the cabin, Mason secured the horses while Victoria lit the lamps, setting them lower than usual, despite her growing comfort with the small flames. Some habits of caution had become ingrained in both of them. Mason placed the metal box on the table between them, examining it carefully in the lamplight. It was well made, the seams tight, the lids secured with a simple but effective latch. No lock, just a clever mechanism that required knowledge rather than a key. May I? He asked, hands hovering above the box. Victoria nodded, leaning forward with anticipation as Mason manipulated the latch according to her instructions. The lid opened with a soft click, revealing the contents protected within. On top lay a leather-bound journal similar to the one Mason had found in Harper's laboratory, but thicker and more comprehensive. Beneath it, a carefully rolled map protected by a wax cloth covering. Several small cloth pouches containing rock samples occupied the remaining space, each meticulously labeled with location coordinates. Victoria reached for the journal with reverent hands, opening it to reveal her father's precise handwriting. His complete research, she confirmed, turning pages filled with diagrams, calculations, and observations. Everything he discovered about the uranium deposits. Mason unrolled the map, securing its corners with small items from the table. It showed the Harper property in exacting detail, with the surrounding lands indicated in less detail, but still clearly identifiable. Red markings indicated test sites with numbers corresponding to entries in the journal. A larger area was shaded in blue, encompassing not only the Harper property, but significant portions of adjacent lands, including Mason's cabin and the surrounding acres. The primary deposit, Victoria explained, tracing the blue area with her fingertip. Father believed this entire region sits atop the main uranium vein. The red marks show where he took samples to confirm his theory. Mason studied the map with growing understanding. No wonder Black wants this. With this map, he could claim the entire deposit before anyone else realizes its value. Exactly, Victoria confirmed grimly. And he'd control whatever future energy applications might develop from uranium research. She turned several pages in the journal, finding a specific passage. Listen to what Father wrote. The energy potential of this element defies current scientific understanding. A single pound of refined uranium may someday produce the equivalent energy of thousands of tons of coal. Whoever controls this resource controls the future of industrial power. Mason whistled softly. That's significant. World-changing, Victoria corrected. And Black knows it, or at least suspects it. That's why, she broke off as a realization struck her. That's why he's been so determined. Not just for immediate profit, but for future power. Mason nodded slowly, the pieces fitting together. A man like Black thinks in terms of empires. This would give him the foundation for one. They spent the next hour examining the contents of the box in detail. Edward Harper's research was meticulous, his observations precise, his conclusions measured but visionary. He had documented not only the location and extent of the uranium deposits, but also preliminary findings on its properties, including its mysterious ability to expose photographic plates without light and its potential energy applications. Your father was years ahead of the scientific community. Mason observed genuine admiration in his voice. This research could significantly advance our understanding of atomic energy. Victoria closed the journal, her expression a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. He always said knowledge should serve humanity, not master it. She looked up at Mason, resolve hardening her features. That's why we can't let Black have this. He'd use it only for profit and power. Agreed, Mason said firmly, but keeping it from him won't be simple. Black knows we have it now or will soon enough when Reed reports back. What do you think Marshal Sullivan will do? Victoria asked, helping Mason carefully return the items to the box. Mason considered the question as he secured the latch. Frank's a man who believes in the law. He'll want statements, evidence, a proper investigation. We have evidence, Victoria pointed out, gesturing to the box. Father's research, the map, my testimony about what happened at the homestead. Yes, but proving Black's direct involvement in your father's murder is another matter. Mason ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. Black is careful. He uses men like Reed to keep his own hands clean. Victoria's face fell slightly as she absorbed the implications. So even with the marshal's help, Black might escape justice for what he did to father. Legally, perhaps, Mason acknowledged. But we can still ensure he doesn't get what he wants. He tapped the metal box. This stays out of his hands, regardless of what happens with the murder investigation. Victoria nodded, determination replacing disappointment. Then we need a plan for protecting it, somewhere safer than here. I have an idea about that, Mason said, moving to the window to check the darkness outside. But first we need rest. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without exhaustion clouding our judgment. Victoria didn't argue the events of the night catching up with her as the adrenaline faded. She moved to the bed, pausing beside Mason at the window. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you have done, for risking yourself for my father's legacy. Mason's blue eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. Some things are worth the risk, he replied simply. As Victoria settled into bed, Mason took his customary position in the chair by the window ranger at his feet. The metal box sat on the table between them, seemingly ordinary, yet containing information that could reshape the future, a future that men like Cornelius Black would kill to control. Outside, the Montana night wrapped around the small cabin like a protective cloak, but Mason knew the darkness that sheltered them now would lift with the dawn, bringing with it the reckoning they could no longer avoid. Morning brought a change in the weather, and dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, and a cool wind that bent the tall grass in waves across the open land. Mason stood on the cabin porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the approaching storm with a weathered tracker's eye. Front moving in, he observed, as Victoria joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. Be honest by afternoon. Will it affect our meeting with the marshal? She asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Mason shook his head. We'll reach town before the worst hits. But it'll make the return journey interesting. They decided over breakfast to take the metal box with them rather than leaving it at the cabin. If Black had men watching Mason's property, at a likely possibility, after Reed's encounter with them, the box would be safer in their direct possession. Victoria sipped her coffee, studying the distant storm clouds. There's something fitting about it, she mused. A storm brewing just as we confront Black. Mason glanced at her, noting the calm resolve that had replaced her earlier fear. In the week and a half since he'd pulled her from the burning barn, Victoria Harper had transformed from victim to formidable ally. Her hands no longer trembled, her eyes no longer darted toward every moving shadow. Instead, she faced forward, her posture straight, her gaze steady. We should prepare to leave, Mason said, finishing his coffee. Town's a 2-hour ride in good weather. With that front approaching, we should allow extra time. They worked efficiently, gathering what they might need for the journey: weapons, rain gear, basic provisions. Mason packed his medical bag as well, a habit formed from years of being the only source of medical care for miles around. As Victoria secured the metal box in a saddlebag designed to distribute its weight evenly behind the saddle, she paused, looking around the cabin. It's strange, she said softly. A week ago, I was certain I'd die in that barn. Now I'm preparing to face the man who put me there. She met Mason's gaze. I never expected to find this: safety, partnership, a chance for justice. Mason nodded, understanding the sentiment behind her words. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, he said simply. Victoria smiled slightly. No, sometimes it burns those paths to ash and forces us to forge new ones. Mason returned her smile, a rare expression that softened the weathered lines of his face. Ready. As I'll ever be, she confirmed, adjusting the revolver at her hip with newfound confidence. They rode out under increasingly threatening skies, the wind picking up as they followed the main trail toward town. Mason led vigilant for any sign of ambush or pursuit, while Victoria kept pace behind him, the precious saddlebag secure against her horse's flank. The small town of Clearwater came into view as the first raindrops began to fall, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the general store, and saloon wisps of smoke from chimneys bending in the strengthening wind. It was typical of the frontier settlements that had sprung up across Montana territory, a tenuous foothold of civilization in the vast wilderness. Mason and Victoria rode directly to the marshal's office, a modest building at the far end of the main street. They dismounted, securing their horses to the hitching post, Mason lifting the saddlebag containing the metal box with careful hands. The marshal's office was empty, save for Sullivan himself, seated behind a desk stacked with papers. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Right on time, he observed, rising to greet them. And just ahead of the weather. Mason glanced around the office, noting the empty cells visible through the open door to the back room. Where's Reed? He asked, setting the saddlebag on a chair. Sullivan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Released this morning. Released, Victoria echoed, disbelief clear in her voice. Marshal, that man works for the man who murdered my father. Sullivan held up a placating hand. I understand your frustration, Miss Harper, but I had no legal grounds to hold him. Trespassing on an abandoned property isn't enough for extended detention, especially when the property's ownership is in question. In question? Victoria's voice rose slightly. It's my family's homestead. According to the land office records, the Harper property was legally transferred to the Rocky Mountain Mining Company 3 days ago. Sullivan explained, his tone carefully neutral. All the paperwork appears to be in order. Mason's eyes narrowed. Appears to be, he repeated, but we both know it's forged. Edward Harper would never have sold to Black. Sullivan didn't contradict him. Instead, he moved to the window, checking the street before drawing the curtains. When he turned back, his official demeanor had shifted slightly, revealing something harder beneath. What I know and what I can prove legally are two different matters, he said quietly. Black has influence with the territorial government. Papers get signed, records get changed, and suddenly a dead man has sold his property before the body's even cold. Victoria sank into a chair, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. So he gets away with it, with murder, with stealing our land. Sullivan's expression softened slightly. I didn't say that, Miss Harper. He moved to his desk, unlocking a drawer and withdrawing a file. I've been building a case against Black for months. Your father's murder and your attempted murder are just the latest in a pattern. Mason set the metal box on Sullivan's desk. This is what Black is really after. Edward Harper's research on uranium deposits in the region. With it, he can identify and claim every valuable tract of land before anyone else realizes what they're sitting on. Sullivan examined the box without touching it. Uranium, the new element the scientists back east have been writing about? Victoria nodded. My father discovered a major deposit. He believed it could revolutionize energy production someday. The research in that box proves it and maps the entire deposit. The marshal whistled softly. No wonder Black's been so aggressive. He looked up at the decision crystallizing in his eyes. This changes things, makes the stakes higher, but also provides leverage. What do you mean? Mason asked. Sullivan leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the empty office. Black's in town, arrived last night, staying at the hotel. Reed's with him, along with 3 other men I don't recognize. They're planning something, and after your encounter last night, I'd wager it involves you two in that box. You're suggesting we use the research as bait. Mason surmised, his expression carefully neutral. I'm suggesting we use Black's desire for it to our advantage, Sullivan corrected. Draw him into showing his hand in a way that can't be explained away with forged documents and bought officials. Victoria exchanged a glance with Mason, a silent communication passing between them. "What exactly are you proposing, Marshall?" she asked. Sullivan outlined his plan, a carefully staged meeting where Black would believe he could obtain the research while Sullivan gathered evidence of his methods and intentions. It was risky, depending heavily on Black's predictable greed and arrogance, but it offered a chance to expose him in a way that even his influence couldn't overcome. "It could work," Mason acknowledged when Sullivan finished, "but it puts Victoria directly in Black's path again. I don't like that." "Neither do I," Sullivan agreed. "But Miss Harper is our strongest witness, and Black's reaction to seeing her alive will be valuable evidence in itself." Victoria straightened in her chair, her decision already made. "I'll do it. I want to see his face when he realizes he failed, that I survived, that I remember everything, and that I have my father's research." Mason studied her determined expression, recognizing the steel beneath it. "Your choice," he said simply, respecting her agency despite his concerns. They spent the next hour refining the plan, addressing contingencies, establishing signals. The storm broke outside, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the valley. Inside the marshal's office, three people prepared to create a storm of their own, one that would either bring justice for Edward Harper or put his daughter in danger once more. As they finalized the details, Mason found himself watching Victoria, her composed demeanor, her sharp intelligence, her unwavering resolve. This woman had emerged from fire not once, but twice in her life, each time forged stronger by the flames. Whatever happened in their confrontation with Black Mason, knew she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through everything else. The storm outside intensified, but within the marshal's office, a calm certainty settled over them. Tomorrow would bring their reckoning with Cornelius Black, a man who had altered both their lives through his ambition and cruelty. Tomorrow would determine whether justice or power would prevail in this corner of the Montana wilderness. And as the rain beat against the windows like impatient fingers, Mason, Victoria, and Marshall Sullivan prepared to meet that reckoning head-on. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a washed-clean world of glistening surfaces and crisp air. Mason stood at the window of the small hotel room they'd taken for the night, watching as Clearwater's main street came to life with the dawn. Shopkeepers swept puddles from wooden walkways. Freight wagons splashed through muddy ruts, and across the street, the brown hotel stood silent and imposing, the temporary residence of Cornelius Black. "He'll expect us to make contact this morning," Mason observed, as Victoria joined him at the window. After Sullivan's message last night, Victoria nodded, her face composed despite the tension evident in her shoulders. She'd slept little, both of them taking turns to guard the metal box containing her father's research. "Do you think he suspects a trap?" "He suspects everything," Mason replied, "but his greed will outweigh his caution. He's waited too long for this research to walk away now." Sullivan had sent a carefully worded message to Black the previous evening, suggesting that Mason Caldwell wished to discuss terms for transferring certain items of interest belonging to the Harper estate. The marshal himself had remained conspicuously absent from the communication, allowing Black to believe he was dealing only with Mason and Victoria. In reality, Sullivan was orchestrating a careful strategy. Deputy marshals had been positioned strategically throughout town, disguised as ordinary citizens. The meeting would take place at the Silver Dollar Saloon at noon, chosen for its central location and multiple exits, both advantages for their plan. "You don't have to do this," Mason said quietly, noting the slight tremor in Victoria's hand as she adjusted her collar. "Sullivan and I can handle Black." Victoria's expression hardened, the momentary vulnerability vanishing. "I told you before, I want to see his face when he realizes I survived, that I remember everything." She met Mason's gaze directly. "I need this, Mason." He nodded, once understanding. Some ghosts could only be laid to rest through direct confrontation. Victoria was claiming her right to face the man who had tried to erase her from existence. A knock at the door interrupted their exchange. Mason moved to answer it, hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. It was Sullivan, his face betraying no emotion as he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Black's men are active this morning," he reported without preamble. "Two watching this building, one at the stables where your horses are kept, and Reed himself positioned at the saloon since dawn." "Thorough," Mason commented, unsurprised. "Professional," Sullivan corrected. "These aren't local thugs. They move like military men." Victoria frowned. "Mercenaries," Sullivan nodded. "Black has connections from the war, men who'll do anything for the right price." His gaze shifted to the metal box sitting on the small table. Is that secure for transport? Yes, Mason confirmed. But remember, we're not actually giving it to Black, just letting him believe he can obtain it. Exactly. Sullivan reviewed the plan one final time, the positioning of his deputies, the signals they would use, the contingencies if things went wrong. Black needs to incriminate himself clearly. I need witnesses to his threats, his admission of knowledge about the Harper murder, anything that ties him directly to the crimes. Victoria listened intently, her expression resolute. And if he doesn't cooperate by confessing, Sullivan's weathered face creased in a humorless smile. Men like Black always want to explain their brilliance. Our job is to give him the opportunity. As noon approached, they made final preparations. Victoria dressed simply but formally, a black dress borrowed from the general store, emphasizing her dignity rather than vulnerability. Mason wore his usual practical attire, but added his old army revolver in a shoulder holster hidden beneath his coat, a second weapon in case his primary sidearm was taken. The metal box was secured in a leather satchel that Mason would carry. Sullivan would enter the saloon separately, positioning himself at the bar, where he could observe without being immediately associated with them. Remember, the marshal cautioned as they prepared to leave. Black is dangerous precisely because he believes himself untouchable. His arrogance is both his weakness and what makes him deadly. Don't underestimate him. Mason met Sullivan's gaze with quiet confidence. I never have, he replied, an undercurrent in his tone that made the marshal look at him more closely. There's history between you two, Sullivan observed, beyond the Harper case. Mason didn't deny it. Another time, another place, he said simply. It doesn't change our purpose today. Sullivan accepted this with a nod, respecting Mason's privacy. Noon then. I'll go first, establish position. Give me 15 minutes, then make your entrance. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect to Victoria. Good luck, Miss Harper. After the marshal departed, Mason and Victoria remained in the hotel room, the minutes ticking by with excruciating slowness. Neither spoke much, each absorbed in private thoughts and preparations. At precisely 12:15, they descended the hotel stairs and stepped into the bright midday sun. The main street was busy with the usual activity of a small frontier town, ranchers purchasing supplies, women shopping freight wagons, loading and unloading. Yet Mason noticed the subtle signs of Sullivan's men in position, the blacksmith who never looked at his forge, the store clerk who kept glancing toward the saloon, the old man whittling on a bench with two alert eyes. They crossed the street, deliberately making no attempt to conceal their approach to the saloon. As they reached the bat-wing doors, Mason placed his hand lightly at the small of Victoria's back, not guiding but supporting. Ready? He asked softly. Victoria drew a steady breath, her chin lifting slightly. Ready. The Silver Dollar Saloon was typical of establishments throughout the Montana Territory, a long bar along one wall, scattered tables, the smell of stale beer and tobacco hanging in the air. Despite the hours, several patrons nursed drinks or played cards. Sullivan sat at the bar, ostensibly focused on his whiskey, though Mason knew he missed nothing. And there at a corner table positioned to view both the front and back entrances, sat Cornelius Black. He was exactly as Mason remembered him, large but not soft, his tailored suit and trimmed beard, creating an impression of civilized refinement that his cold eyes betrayed. Silas Reed stood behind his chair like a shadow, while two other men Mason didn't recognize occupied nearby tables, their positions too strategic to be coincidental. Black looked up as they entered, his expression changing in swift succession, anticipation at seeing Mason with the satchel, shock at seeing Victoria alive, and finally a calculated mask of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Caldwell, he greeted, rising to his feet. How good of you to come. His gaze shifted to Victoria, something predatory flickering behind his smile. And Miss Harper, I must say reports of your death were greatly exaggerated. Attempted murder is like that, Victoria replied evenly. Sometimes it fails. If Black was unsettled by her directness, he didn't show it. Please join me, he invited, gesturing to the empty chairs at his table. We have much to discuss. Mason positioned himself so that Victoria sat with her back to the wall while he could observe both Black in the room at large. The satchel he placed deliberately on the floor beside his chair, within reach, but not immediately accessible. Drink, Black offered, signaling the bartender. We're not here for hospitality, Mason replied, his tone businesslike. Let's discuss terms. Black's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Direct as always? Very well. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the satchel. I understand you have items belonging to the Harper estate, items of significant scientific interest. My father's research, Victoria clarified, on deposits that exist beneath our land, land that now appears mysteriously to belong to your company. Black spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. Nothing mysterious about it, Miss Harper. Your father sold the property legally before his unfortunate accident. My father was murdered, Victoria stated flatly, shot through the head execution style, and I was locked in our barn to burn alive. Those weren't accidents, Mr. Black. Several nearby patrons glanced over at her, words quickly returning to their drinks when Reed stared them down. Black's expression remained unruffled, though something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. Tragic events, certainly, he acknowledged smoothly, but I fail to see how they connect to a legitimate business transaction. Mason leaned forward slightly. Let's be clear, Black. We know what you want. Edward Harper's research on uranium deposits, his maps, his findings, his samples. He tapped the satchel with his foot. It's all here. Greed flashed across Black's face before he could mask it. And what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Caldwell? A trade, Mason replied. The research for certain considerations. Such as, Victoria spoke before Mason could answer. Justice for my father, acknowledgement of what really happened, return of our land. Black studied her for a long moment, his expression calculating. Curious demands from a dead woman. He observed his tone suddenly harder. Legally, you no longer exist, Miss Harper. The property transfer is complete, your father's death ruled accidental, and your own demise documented by multiple witnesses. He smiled thinly. Your demands have no legal standing. Perhaps not, Mason interjected, but the research does. Without it, those deposits remain hidden, their exact locations unknown. You have the land, but not the knowledge to exploit it properly. Black's attention shifted back to Mason, a newfound respect in his gaze. You understand business better than I expected, Caldwell. He leaned back, signaling to the bartender to bring drinks despite their earlier refusal. Very well. Let's negotiate. What do you really want for that research? Mason exchanged a glance with Victoria, their silent communication now practiced and fluid. $200,000, he stated, and signed confessions from you and Reed regarding Edward Harper's murder. A bark of laughter escaped Black before he could contain it. Confessions, really, Caldwell? I expected something more realistic. Those are our terms, Victoria said firmly. The research for justice and compensation. Black's amusement faded, replaced by a cold assessment. You're not in a position to dictate terms, Miss Harper. You're legally dead, remember. And you, Caldwell, his gaze shifted to Mason. You're harboring a fugitive and interfering in legitimate business affairs. Neither of you is operating from strength. Then why are you here, Mason countered. If we're so powerless, why meet with us at all? The bartender arrived with drinks, placing them on the table before retreating. Black lifted his glass, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. Efficiency, he replied after a moment. I could obtain what I need through other means, but this seemed more civilized. His eyes hardened. But my patience has limits. Victoria leaned forward, her voice low but intense. You murdered my father. You ordered men to chain me in our barn and burn me alive. You've stolen our land and tried to erase our existence. Her green eyes blazed with controlled fury. Do you really think I fear your limits now, Mr. Black? Something in her tone gave Black pause. He studied her face, seeming to truly see her for the first time, not as a victim or obstacle, but as a formidable opponent. What happened to Edward Harper was unfortunate, but necessary, he said finally, his voice dropping to ensure only they could hear. He refused reasonable offers. He threatened to take his findings public to alert the government to the strategic importance of the deposits. Black's expression hardened. I couldn't allow that. Mason tensed, recognizing the confession they needed, but aware that Black wouldn't have revealed it without confidence in his position. Victoria remained focused on Black, drawing him out further. And me? She asked quietly. Why try to kill me that way? Why not a bullet like my father? Black's smile chilled Mason to the bone. Reed has a certain theatrical approach to eliminating problems. And frankly, my dear, no one would question a tragic fire at a remote homestead. Accidents happen on the frontier all the time. Victoria didn't flinch from his casual acknowledgement of attempted murder. You miscalculated, Mr. Black. I survived. A temporary inconvenience. Black replied, his mask of civility slipping further. One that can still be rectified. From the corner of his eye, Mason noticed Sullivan shift slightly at the bar, hand moving toward his concealed weapon. The marshal had heard enough to act. But before he could make his move, the saloon doors swung open, admitting 3 more men whose hands rested too casually near their holstered weapons. Black's reinforcements right on schedule. Now, Black said, his tone hardening as the balance of power shifted visibly in his favor. I believe we can dispense with the charade. The satchel, if you please, Mr. Caldwell. Mason didn't move. And if I refuse, Black sighed as if disappointed by Mason's predictability, then this establishment will require significant repairs after we're finished. And unfortunately, neither of you will be around to see them completed. The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. Around the room, hands moved to weapons, Black's men preparing to act, Sullivan's deputies tensing to intervene. The other patrons, sensing the changing atmosphere, began edging toward the doors. Mason glanced at Victoria, saw the steady resolve in her eyes, and made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down for the satchel. A wise choice, Black approved. Despite our differences, I've always appreciated practicality. Mason placed the satchel on the table but kept his hand firmly on its strap. First, a question, he said, his voice steady. Do you remember Gettysburg, Black, the field hospital on Cemetery Ridge? Black's expression flickered with momentary confusion. What? July 1863. Mason continued, his blue eyes locked on Black's face. 17 Union soldiers died in a fire. A field nurse was blamed. Recognition dawned slowly in Black's eyes, followed by disbelief as he studied Mason's face more carefully. Caldwell, he breathed, the name carrying new significance. Mason Caldwell, the nurse from Cemetery Ridge. Mason nodded once, satisfaction flickering across his features. The same. Black's shock quickly morphed into calculation. Remarkable coincidence, he observed, recovering his composure, though I fail to see its relevance to our current business. No coincidence, Mason corrected. When Victoria mentioned your name after I rescued her, I knew exactly who had ordered her death. The same man who falsified reports at Gettysburg, who needed a scapegoat to cover his own corruption. Victoria glanced between them, absorbing this new information. What is he talking about, Black? Black's expression hardened. In ancient history, wartime confusion, nothing more. He was the quartermaster, Mason explained, never taking his eyes from Black, responsible for medical supplies. But those supplies had a way of disappearing: morphine, chloroform, surgical tools. Items that commanded high prices on the black market. You have no proof, Black snapped, the first crack in his composed facade. Never did. I do now, Mason replied evenly. Marshal Sullivan has been collecting evidence for months. Testimonies from surviving medical staff, records of supply discrepancies, even a deathbed confession from your former assistant. Sullivan chose that moment to turn from the bar, facing their table directly. His badge glinted in the saloon's dim light as he approached each step, deliberate. Cornelius Black, the marshal announced formally. I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Edward Harper, the attempted murder of Victoria Harper, land fraud and conspiracy. Black's face twisted with fury and disbelief. This is absurd. You have no jurisdiction over business matters, Sullivan, and no evidence connecting me to any crimes against the Harpers. We have your confession, Sullivan countered calmly, witnessed by myself and several deputies present in this establishment. He nodded toward various patrons, who now revealed badges or weapons, and we have Reed's testimony as well. At this, Black's head snapped toward his lieutenant. Reed, he demanded. What is he talking about? Silas Reed remained impassive, but his hand had moved away from his weapon. Insurance, Mr. Black, he explained with cold practicality. I've worked with you long enough to know what happens to subordinates who outlive their usefulness. The betrayal seemed to physically strike Black, his face flushing with rage. You treacherous, considerate business, Reed interrupted, echoing Black's own frequent justification for cruelty. Nothing personal. Black's control finally shattered. With surprising speed for a man his size, He lunged across the table, reaching not for Reed, but for the satchel still in Mason's grasp. In the same motion, he drew a derringer from his vest pocket, aiming it at Victoria's head. "The research or she dies," he shouted, desperation making his voice sharp. Everything happened at once. Mason shoved Victoria sideways as Black fired the bullet, splintering the wall where her head had been moments before. Sullivan drew his revolver. Deputies converged from all directions, and Black's remaining men reached for their weapons, only to find themselves comprehensively outgunned. Black himself froze, the smoking derringer still in his hand, as Mason's Remington pressed cold against his temple. "Drop it," Mason ordered, his voice deadly quiet. For a tense moment, Black seemed to consider his options. Then slowly he uncurled his fingers, letting the derringer clatter to the table. "It's over, Black," Sullivan announced, stepping forward to take the man's weapon. "Your men are surrounded. Reed has turned on you, and we have your confession." Black's face contorted with hatred as deputies moved in to secure him. "This isn't justice," he spat. "This is persecution of a legitimate businessman by corrupt officials." His gaze locked on Mason. "You've carried a grudge for 12 years, Caldwell. Is this your idea of revenge?" Mason holstered his revolver, his expression betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. "This isn't about Gettysburg," he replied evenly. "This is about Edward Harper, about Victoria, about the fact that you believe your ambition justifies any cruelty." As the deputies handcuffed Black, Victoria stepped forward, facing her would-be murderer directly. "You failed, Mr. Black," she said quietly. "You killed my father, but his work will survive. You tried to kill me, but I survived. You tried to steal our legacy, but justice prevailed." Black stared at her with cold hatred. "Don't be so certain, Miss Harper. Men like me have resources beyond your comprehension. This isn't the end." "Take him," Sullivan ordered, and the deputies led Black away, his threats echoing in their wake. When he was gone, the tension in the room dissipated like air from a punctured balloon. Victoria swayed slightly, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb. Mason's hand found her elbow, steadying her without making her appear weak. "You did well," he said quietly. Victoria drew a shaky breath. "Is it really over?" "The immediate danger, yes," Sullivan answered, holstering his weapon. "Black will face trial for multiple charges. With Reed's testimony and Black's own confession, conviction is likely." "And the research?" Victoria asked, glancing at the satchel still in Mason's possession. "Remains yours," Sullivan confirmed, "though I'd suggest securing it somewhere safer than Clearwater until the trial concludes. Black's resources include men who won't be deterred by his arrest." Mason nodded in agreement. "I have contacts in Helena who can help, people who understand the importance of keeping it protected." Victoria accepted this with a nod, the events of the past hour catching up with her. "I need air," she said simply. Mason guided her outside, away from the curious onlookers gathering at the saloon doors. They walked in silence to a small bench beneath an oak tree at the edge of town, its branches providing shelter from the midday sun. "You never told me," Victoria said after a long moment, "about your history with Black." Mason sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "It seemed irrelevant initially. Then as we grew closer, the right moment never presented itself." "You knew who he was from the beginning," she observed, "when I first mentioned his name." "Yes." "Does that change things? Knowing he's connected to both our tragedies?" Mason considered her question carefully. "It makes a certain sense," he finally replied. "Black has always exploited others for gain, always placed his ambitions above human life." He glanced at her. "But no, it doesn't change the essential facts. He murdered your father. He tried to kill you. Those crimes stand independently of his past with me." Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "What happens now?" "Black goes to trial. Sullivan builds his case. You reclaim your property and your father's legacy." Mason's gaze moved to the distant mountains still glistening from the previous night's rain. "Life continues." Victoria studied his profile, the strong lines of his face softened by the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak leaves. "And us?" she asked softly. "What happens to us, Mason?" He turned to meet her gaze, something unguarded in his blue eyes. "That depends on what you want, Victoria. Your life has been upended, reshaped by forces beyond your control. Once the danger truly passes, once Black is sentenced, you'll have choices again. And if my choice is to stay, she asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the question. To rebuild on my father's land, but not alone. Mason's expression softened in a way she'd rarely seen the careful control he maintained, giving way to something more human, more hopeful. Then you wouldn't be alone, he replied simply. It wasn't a declaration of love. Both of them had endured too much, healed too recently for such certainties. But it was a promise, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed between them through fire and danger and quiet moments of understanding. Victoria's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with natural ease. Together they sat in companionable silence, watching as life continued in the small frontier town around them, ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unaware of the momentous confrontation that had just occurred, or the technological revolution hidden in a leather satchel at Mason's feet. The trial of Cornelius Black became something of a sensation in Montana territory. Newspapers from as far as Helena and even Denver sent reporters to cover the proceedings. The combination of murder, attempted murder, land fraud, and the mysterious scientific discovery at the center of it all captured the public imagination. Victoria testified with composure and clarity, recounting the night of her father's murder and her own near death in the burning barn. Mason provided corroborating testimony about finding her, about the evidence discovered at the Harper homestead, and most damaging to Black, about the confrontation in the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Black had admitted ordering the crimes. Silas Reed, seeking leniency for his own involvement, provided detailed testimony about Black's operations, his methods, and the specific orders given regarding Edward Harper. Mr. Black instructed me to make an example of the girl. Reed testified, his scarred face impassive as he described the events. Said fear would ensure compliance from other landowners in the region. Black maintained his innocence throughout, claiming conspiracy and persecution. But the evidence was overwhelming. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Cornelius Black, the judge announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. You have been found guilty of the murder of Edward Harper, the attempted murder of Victoria Harper, land fraud, and conspiracy. These crimes display a callous disregard for human life and the laws of this territory. He paused, his expression severe. I hereby sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, said sentence to be carried out 1 month from today. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Capital punishment was not uncommon in the territory, but few had expected it for a man of Black's stature and connections. Yet the brutality of his crimes, particularly the attempted burning of Victoria, had shocked even the frontier sensibilities of the jury and judge. As Black was led away, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, his gaze found Mason and Victoria sitting side by side in the front row. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, a silent promise of retribution, even as the prison door closed behind him. It's truly over, Victoria whispered, the tension of the past weeks finally releasing its grip on her shoulders. Mason nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. The immediate threat, yes. Sullivan joined them as the courtroom emptied, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. Justice served, he noted with quiet pride, though I'd still recommend caution until the sentence is carried out. Black has resources, even from a cell. We'll be careful, Mason assured him, but it's time we returned home. Home. The word carried new meaning now. In the weeks since their confrontation with Black in the saloon, Mason and Victoria had begun planning for the future. The Harper homestead would be rebuilt, Victoria reclaiming her family's land and legacy. Mason's cabin, too, would remain a short ride away, close enough for partnership, but allowing each their independence as they navigated their evolving relationship. Edward Harper's research had been secured in a bank vault in Helena, awaiting Victoria's decision on its ultimate destination. Professor Williams at Columbia University had expressed keen interest in continuing the work, potentially developing the energy applications Edward had foreseen. As they left the courthouse, stepping into the bright Montana sunshine, Victoria paused to look back at the imposing building where justice had finally been served. My father would be satisfied, she said softly, not with revenge, but with the triumph of truth over power. Mason nodded understanding. He raised a daughter who embodies those same principles. Victoria smiled, a genuine expression untinged by the grief that had shadowed her features for so long. Let's go home, Mason. The journey back to their corner of Montana territory took 3 days, the landscape transitioning from rolling plains to the more rugged terrain that marked the approach to their properties. As they crested the final ridge, the view opened before them, the distant silhouette of Mason's cabin, the charred remains of the Harper homestead beyond. Victoria reined in her horse, surveying the land that was now truly hers again. The legal documents in her saddlebag confirmed that all claims by the Rocky Mountain Mining Company had been invalidated, the property returned to Harper ownership. "It looks different somehow," she observed, "knowing it's truly mine again." Mason nodded in understanding. Land has a way of changing with our perception of it. They rode down the slope toward Mason's cabin, Ranger racing ahead with the exuberance of a mod returning to familiar territory. As they approached, Victoria noted small changes. The wood stacked neatly beside the cabin had been replenished. The garden tended despite their absence, the windows cleaned. "Sullivan sent someone to check on the place," Mason explained, noting her surprise. "One of his deputies has a wife who believes in the restorative power of clean windows." Victoria laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the Montana quiet. "Civilization encroaches even here." They dismounted, tending to the horses with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to working together. Inside the cabin, everything remained as they had left it, simple, orderly, the oil lamps waiting to be lit as evening approached. Victoria moved to the stove, her initial hesitancy around fire long since overcome through necessity and Mason's patient guidance. She lit it with practiced ease, preparing coffee while Mason brought in their bags. "I'll ride out to my father's property tomorrow," she said as they settled at the small table, coffee mugs warming their hands. "Start planning the rebuilding." Mason nodded. "I'll go with you if you'd like. The foundation is still solid. Most of the work will be the new framing and roof." "I'd appreciate that." Victoria's gaze moved to the window, to the lengthening afternoon shadows. "It won't be the same, of course, but perhaps that's appropriate. A new chapter requires a new structure." They spent the evening in comfortable domesticity, sharing tasks with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms. As darkness fell, Mason lit fewer lamps than had once been his custom, just enough for comfortable light, no longer needing the excessive illumination that had once kept his demons at bay. Victoria noticed the change but didn't comment. Some healing occurred in obvious ways, like her own growing comfort around controlled flames. Other healing happened more subtly, marked by what was no longer needed, rather than what was newly embraced. The next morning dawned clear and cool, autumn beginning to assert itself in the crispness of the air and the changing colors of the foliage. They rode to the Harper property together, Victoria leading the way with a confidence that grew as they approached. The homestead remained much as they had last seen it, the main house, a hollow shell, the barn reduced to blackened timbers, the storage shed partially collapsed. Yet in daylight, without the urgency of their previous visits, Victoria could see beyond the destruction to the possibility of renewal. "We'll start there," she decided, pointing to the foundation of the main house. The same footprint, but with improvements. Larger windows on the east side to capture the morning light. Perhaps a proper laboratory space for continuing father's work. Mason dismounted, surveying the site with a builder's eye. "The stonework is sound," he confirmed. "We can begin framing once the lumber arrives." Victoria asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mason glanced up, realizing his assumption. "If you'd like my help," he amended. "I would." Victoria dismounted, joining him beside the foundation. "Very much." They spent the morning measuring, planning, listing materials that would be needed. Victoria moved through the ruins of her childhood home, not with grief, but with purpose, salvaging what could be reused, envisioning what would replace what couldn't. Near midday, they paused for rest and water beneath the great oak where Edward Harper's research had been buried. The metal box was now secure in Helena, but the tree remained a symbol of continuity, of knowledge preserved despite attempts to destroy it. "I've been thinking about Father's research," Victoria said, leaning against the massive trunk, "about what to do with it." Mason sat beside her, offering the canteen. "You mentioned Professor Williams at Columbia." She nodded, taking a drink before continuing. "He was Father's colleague and friend. He understands the importance of developing uranium energy responsibly." She passed the canteen back to Mason, her expression thoughtful. "But I'm considering another option as well." "Oh, continuing some aspects of the research myself," Victoria explained. "Not the theoretical physics, that's beyond my training, but the geological surveys, the mapping of deposits, ensuring they're documented properly for future scientific use." Her green eyes met his seeking reaction. "It would mean establishing a proper laboratory here. equipment correspondence with scientific journals, occasional visits from researchers. Mason considered this understanding the implications. Not exactly the quiet ranching life most women seek in Montana Territory. Victoria laughed softly. I think we established long ago that I'm not most women. Indeed we did, Mason agreed, a smile warming his blue eyes. I think it's an excellent idea. Your father would be proud. And you, Victoria asked, her question carrying more weight than the casual words suggested. Would you be comfortable with such a unconventional neighbor? Mason's expression grew serious, thoughtful. Victoria, I pulled you from a burning building, tended your wounds, stood beside you against armed killers, and watched you face down the man who murdered your father without flinching. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. I admire your courage, your intelligence, your determination. Conventional or unconventional matters far less than the person you are. Victoria's free hand moved to touch the silver chain at Mason's neck, a gesture he now allowed the barrier of privacy between them long since dissolved. And who am I, Mason Caldwell? She asked softly. He considered her question with the same careful attention he gave to everything. You're a survivor, he answered finally. A woman who emerged from fire not once, but twice, each time stronger. You're your father's daughter, carrying forward his legacy of knowledge and integrity. And Mom, his voice softened, you're the woman who helped a broken healer remember his purpose. Victoria's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion. Wordlessly, she leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that conveyed what words could not: gratitude. Connection, the promise of a future neither had dared imagine weeks earlier. When they parted, Mason's expression held a rare openness, the careful control he maintained giving way to genuine emotion. We should finish our measurements, he suggested, though he made no move to rise. Victoria smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was: not rejection, but the caution of a man unaccustomed to expressing feelings so openly. We should, she agreed, allowing him the space to retreat to practicality. There's much to be done before winter. They resumed their work, the kiss neither referenced nor forgotten, simply absorbed into the evolving fabric of their relationship. By late afternoon, they had completed their assessment and begun clearing debris, the first tangible steps toward rebuilding. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they prepared to return to Mason's cabin. Victoria paused for one final look at her property, not as it was, but as it would be. It will be different, Mason observed, reading her thoughts with the intuition that had developed between them. But perhaps better in its own way. Victoria nodded, squeezing his hand briefly. Like us, she said simply. The weeks passed in a rhythm of work and recovery. Lumber arrived from the sawmill in town, and the framework of the new Harper house began to take shape against the autumn sky. Mason split his time between the rebuilding efforts and his medical duties to the scattered homesteads that relied on his skills. Victoria divided her attention between construction and corresponding with Professor Williams about her father's research. The professor's enthusiasm was evident in his letters, each one filled with theories and questions about the uranium deposits and their potential applications. He wants to visit in the spring, Victoria announced one evening as they shared dinner in Mason's cabin, to see the deposits himself and discuss establishing a proper field research station. Mason nodded, unsurprised. The house should be completed by then, including your laboratory space. Our progress has been remarkable, Victoria agreed, glancing toward the window. Though darkness had fallen, she could envision the partially constructed building visible from this vantage point in daylight. We couldn't have accomplished so much without help from the neighbors. It was true. Once word spread of Black's crimes and the Harper tragedy's support had materialized from unexpected quarters. Homesteaders from miles around had arrived with tools and willing hands, raising wall frames in a single day, contributing labor and materials with the frontier spirit of community that transcended the usual isolation of their lives. People respect what your father stood for, Mason observed, and they admire your determination to rebuild. Victoria smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. The same neighbors who had once viewed Edward Harper as an eccentric recluse now spoke of him with respect, even reverence. His scientific work, simplified and translated through Victoria's careful explanations, had become a source of local pride. As they cleared the table together, Victoria noticed Mason glance repeatedly toward the window, his movements slightly more alert than usual. "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the signs of his heightened vigilance. Mason hesitated, then admitted, "Ranger's been restless all evening. Might be nothing deer or coyotes, but you don't take chances." Victoria finished, understanding immediately. Since Black's sentencing, they had maintained careful awareness of their surroundings, heeding Sullivan's warning about the man's resources extending beyond his prison cell. Mason moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. "Probably nothing," he repeated, though his hand drifted unconsciously toward the revolver hanging by the door. Victoria joined him, peering into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing around the cabin. Nothing moved in the illuminated space, but the shadows beyond the tree line remained impenetrable. "I'll check the horses," Mason decided, reaching for his coat. "Just to be certain." Victoria nodded, moving to retrieve her own jacket. "I'll come with you." Mason paused, about to object, then recognized the determination in her expression. Together they had faced Black. Together they would face whatever lingering threat his influence might present. They stepped outside into the crisp autumn night breath, fogging in the cool air. Ranger emerged from beneath the porch hackles, slightly raised his one good eye, scanning the tree line. Mason drew his revolver, the action smooth and practiced. "The horses are restless," Victoria observed in a whisper, noting the movement in the small corral beside the cabin. Mason nodded, placing himself slightly ahead of her as they moved toward the agitated animals. The horses shifted nervously, ears flicking back and forth, eyes reflecting moonlight in brief flashes as they tossed their heads. Something had disturbed them, something beyond the usual night sounds of the Montana wilderness. Mason signaled Victoria to remain by the corral gate while he circled the perimeter, Ranger close at his heels. The dog's behavior confirmed Mason's suspicion someone or something was nearby, hidden in the shadows beyond the moonlight's reach. A twig snapped in the darkness, the sound unnaturally loud in the night's stillness. Mason froze, weapon raised, eyes straining to penetrate the gloom beneath the pines. "Caldwell," a voice called softly from the shadows. "Don't shoot, it's Sullivan." Mason's posture relaxed slightly, though his weapon remained ready. "Step into the light, Frank." Marshal Sullivan emerged from the tree line, his badge catching the moonlight as he approached. He was alone, his horse nowhere in sight. "Apologize for the dramatics," he said as he reached them, "but I didn't want to be seen approaching." "What's happened?" Victoria asked, tension evident in her voice. Sullivan's expression confirmed their unspoken fears. "Black escaped during transport to the territorial prison in Deer Lodge. Killed 2 guards. Mason's jaw tightened. "When?" "Yesterday morning. I rode straight here as soon as I got word." Sullivan glanced around, his posture still alert. He had helped professional, and he made certain statements before escaping that suggested he had unfinished business with you two. Victoria's hand found Mason's arm, not seeking protection, but reinforcing their partnership in the face of renewed danger. "You think he's coming here?" "I think it's likely," Sullivan confirmed grimly. "Black is not a man who leaves loose ends, and you two represent his greatest failure." Mason nodded, once decision crystallizing. "We'll need to prepare. How long do you think we have?" Sullivan considered. "He was last seen heading east from Deer Lodge. If he's coming here, and I believe he is, he'll need to gather men's supplies. 2 days, maybe 3. Then we have work to do," Mason said, his tone shifting from concern to focused determination. He turned to Victoria. "We should move everything valuable to the root cellar. It's the most defensible space if things go badly." Victoria nodded, already calculating what would need to be secured: the copies of her father's research, their essential supplies, anything that couldn't be replaced. "I'll begin immediately." "I brought extra ammunition," Sullivan offered, patting his saddlebags, "and sent word to several deputies I trust. They'll arrive by tomorrow evening, positioning themselves discreetly in the surrounding area." Mason clasped Sullivan's shoulder in gratitude. "Thank you, Frank, for the warning and the help." The marshal's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "Black made this personal for all of us when he killed those guards. Good men with families." He glanced between Mason and Victoria. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of you two. Would be a shame to let Black destroy what you're building here." They moved inside to continue planning. The peaceful evening transformed into a council of war. Maps were spread on the table, defensive positions, identified strategies developed for various scenarios. Victoria participated fully, her suggestions practical and insightful, her composure remarkable, given the renewed threat to her life. As the night deepened, Sullivan departed to establish his own position in the surrounding forest, promising to return at first light with updates. Mason and Victoria remained at the table refining their preparations until exhaustion finally compelled them to rest. "You should take the bed," Mason suggested as they completed their planning. "I'll keep watch." Victoria shook her head. "We both need rest to be effective tomorrow. We'll take shifts." Her expression brooked no argument. "You taught me to shoot, Mason. Taught me to defend myself. Let me use those skills now." He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing not the traumatized woman he'd pulled from the burning barn, but the strong, determined partner who had emerged from that ordeal. "2-hour shifts," he agreed finally. "I'll take the first wake, you at midnight." Victoria nodded, accepting the compromise. As she prepared for her brief rest, she paused beside Mason, her hand touching his shoulder. "We've faced him before and prevailed," she reminded him softly. "We will again." Mason covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her certainty. "Yes," he agreed, "we will." Outside, the Montana night continued its ancient rhythm, stars wheeling overhead, nocturnal creatures hunting and hiding, the wind whispering through pine needles. But beneath this timeless pattern, a new tension had emerged, the approaching confrontation that would determine whether the future Mason and Victoria envisioned together would have the chance to unfold. Dawn broke clear and cold, the first frost of the season silvering the landscape around the cabin. Mason stood on the porch, coffee mug, warming his hands as he surveyed their preparations. The previous day had been spent in focused activity, reinforcing windows, establishing clear lines of sight, positioning supplies for easy access during a potential siege. Sullivan's promised deputies had arrived by mid-afternoon, 4 experienced men who understood frontier violence and respected Mason's authority in defending his home. They had dispersed to predetermined positions in the surrounding forest, establishing a perimeter that would provide early warning of approaching threats. Victoria joined Mason on the porch, her own coffee steaming in the morning chill. She had dressed practically in trousers and one of Mason's old shirts, her hair tied back securely, a gun belt at her waist. Nothing in her posture or expression suggested fear, only readiness. "Beautiful morning," she observed, her breath fogging in the cool air. Mason nodded, appreciating her composure. "Sullivan believes they'll come at dusk if they come today. Harder to defend against in the failing light." Victoria sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Logical, though Black's hatred may override tactical considerations." "True." Mason's gaze swept the tree line, alert for any movement. "How are you feeling?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "Determined," she answered after a moment. "Not afraid exactly, more resolved." She glanced at him. "Is that strange?" "No," Mason replied, understanding completely. "Fear serves when it sharpens our senses. Beyond that, it becomes a liability." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the rising sun burned away the frost, transforming the silvered landscape back to autumn gold and russet. Whatever came with the day's end, this moment of peace, of partnership, was theirs to hold. Sullivan appeared from the tree line just as they finished breakfast, his expression grave but controlled. "Ryder came through from the western checkpoint," he reported without preamble. 6 men matching Black's description and known associates passed through Clearwater Water yesterday evening, heading this way. Mason absorbed this information with a nod. "Today, then." "Likely," Sullivan agreed. "My men are positioned along the western approach. They'll send warning when Black's group is spotted." Victoria rose from the table, gathering the breakfast dishes with practiced efficiency. "Then we have preparations to complete." The day passed in tense anticipation. Mason checked and rechecked their defenses, positioned ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin, and ensured their escape route to the root cellar remained clear. Victoria maintained her calm efficiency, preparing food and water that could be consumed during potential breaks in conflict, her movements deliberate and focused. By mid-afternoon, the warning they had anticipated arrived, a deputy riding hard from the western perimeter, reporting 6 armed men approaching along the main trail, led by a large man in a city coat, whose description matched Black perfectly. 2 hours, maybe less, the deputy estimated, before riding off to rejoin his colleagues. Mason gathered their small defense force for final instructions, Sullivan the 4 deputies who had now converged on the cabin, Victoria and himself. 7 against 6, seemingly favorable odds, yet Black's men would be professional killers, their skills honed through years of vigilance. "They'll expect us to concentrate our defense here at the cabin," Mason explained, indicating positions on the rough map he'd drawn. Sullivan's men will create the impression of a defensive perimeter while actually positioning for crossfire once the attackers commit to their approach. The deputies nodded, understanding the strategy. It was a hunter's tactic, allowing the prey to believe it had identified all threats before springing the true trap. Victoria and I will be visible inside, Mason continued, drawing their attention to the cabin while you maneuver into position. Sullivan frowned slightly. That puts you at considerable risk. The cabin is more defensible than it appears, Mason assured him, and we need Black to commit fully to the attack. He won't do that if he suspects a larger force. Victoria spoke up, her voice steady. Black wants us, specifically us. His escape this attack, it's personal. He'll take risks he ordinarily wouldn't to reach us. Sullivan couldn't argue with this assessment. Black's hatred for Mason and Victoria had been evident throughout his trial. His final threats as he was led away, making clear his intentions should he ever gain freedom. Very well, the marshal conceded, but at the first sign that the cabin is being overrun, you retreat to the root cellar. No heroics. Mason nodded his agreement, though something in his eyes suggested he had contingencies beyond those they'd discussed openly. As the deputies dispersed to their positions, Sullivan remained behind momentarily. Black won't surrender, he said quietly, ensuring only Mason and Victoria could hear. He knows what awaits him if captured. I'm aware, Mason replied, equally low. We'll do what's necessary. Sullivan studied them both, seeing the resolve in their expressions, then nodded once and departed to take his position. Alone in the cabin, Mason and Victoria completed their final preparations. The metal box containing copies of Edward Harper's most crucial research was already secured in the root cellar, along with emergency supplies should they need to remain there for an extended period. Remember, Mason said as they positioned themselves for the approaching confrontation, stay away from the windows once it begins. The walls are reinforced, but the glass is vulnerable. Victoria checked her revolver, her movements precise as Mason had taught her. I remember. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part, the knowledge that violence approached the uncertainty of when exactly it would arrive. They passed the time in quiet conversation, discussing plans for the Harper House, reconstruction for the laboratory Victoria envisioned for the future they still intended to build despite the threat currently moving toward them. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, shadows lengthening across the clearing around the cabin. Mason positioned himself near the front window, field glasses in hand, scanning the tree line methodically. Movement, he reported calmly. Western approach, just as Sullivan predicted. Victoria joined him, careful to stay beside rather than in front of the window. Through the field glasses, she could make out riders emerging from the forest. 6 men, as reported, their approach unhurried but purposeful. At their center rode a large figure she recognized immediately, Cornelius Black, his bearing unmistakable, even at this distance. They're making no attempt at concealment, Mason observed, lowering the glasses. He believes himself invincible, Victoria replied, recognizing the arrogance in Black's direct approach. His downfall before and now again. Mason handed her the field glasses, moving to retrieve his rifle from beside the door. Take position at the back window. Watch for anyone trying to circle around. Victoria nodded, moving to her assigned position, while Mason returned to the front. The riders had reached the edge of the clearing, now stopping just within the tree line, planning their final approach. Through the gathering dusk, Mason could see Black gesturing, directing his men. 2 dismounted, disappearing into the forest to circle around exactly as anticipated. Sullivan's men would intercept them before they reached their flanking positions. The remaining 4, including Black, continued forward, spreading out as they approached the cabin. They moved with the confidence of men accustomed to violence, unaware of the deputies concealed in the surrounding forest. Mason waited, rifle ready, but not yet raised. The plan required Black to commit fully to the attack, to believe his target was within easy reach. 50 yards from the cabin, Black raised his hand, halting his men. Caldwell, he called, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. I know you're in there, you and the Harper woman both. Mason remained silent, watching as Black dismounted, his movements betraying suppressed rage beneath his controlled exterior. Did you think a prison could hold me? Black continued. Did you think I would allow you to destroy everything I've built? He gestured expansively, encompassing the cabin and the partially reconstructed Harper homestead, visible in the distance. All this could have been avoided if you had simply given me what I wanted. Still, Mason made no response. Victoria had joined him at the front window, her expression calm despite the approaching danger. Black's composure began to fray at the edges, his voice taking on a sharper edge. I'm offering you one final opportunity. Caldwell, surrender Harper's research, and I'll grant you both quick deaths. Continue defying me, and I promise you suffering beyond imagination. When no response came, Black turned to his men. Burn it, he ordered, his voice cold with finality. Burn it to the ground with them inside. Let them experience what they escaped before. Two of the men dismounted, retrieving containers from their saddlebags, kerosene presumably to accelerate the fire. They began advancing toward the cabin, confident in their numerical superiority, unaware of the deputies positioning for crossfire. Mason raised his rifle, sighting carefully. Get ready, he murmured to Victoria, who had taken position at the second window, her own weapon prepared. Black remained by the horses, watching with evident satisfaction as his men approached the cabin. His escape, his return, his imminent revenge, all unfolding according to his design. Or so he believed. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the forest to their right, one of Sullivan's deputies engaging the flanking attackers. The carefully orchestrated trap had been sprung prematurely. Black reacted instantly, diving for cover behind a fallen log, as his men scattered, abandoning their incendiary mission for defensive positions. The element of surprise lost the conflict, devolved into a chaotic exchange of gunfire, deputies firing from concealed positions in the forest, Black's men returning fire while seeking better cover. Mason's rifle cracked, dropping one of Black's men with a shoulder wound that took him out of the fight without killing him. Victoria held her fire, waiting for a clear target rather than wasting ammunition. Through the growing darkness, punctuated by muzzle flashes and shouts, Mason lost sight of Black himself. The large man had disappeared in the initial confusion, his exact position now unknown. Where is he? Victoria asked, scanning the battlefield with growing concern. Mason shook his head, equally uncertain. Black's absence from the main conflict raised alarms. A man like Black wouldn't retreat, wouldn't abandon his vengeance so easily. A sudden crash from the rear of the cabin answered their unspoken question. Black had circled around during the confusion, avoiding both the deputies in the forest and their own vigilance. Root cellar, Mason ordered, recognizing the vulnerability of their position. Now. Victoria moved immediately toward the trapdoor, concealed beneath a rug in the corner, Mason close behind. She had just reached it when the back door splintered inward, the lock giving way under tremendous force. Black stood framed in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands and hatred burning in his eyes. Found you, he snarled, raising the weapon toward Victoria. Mason lunged forward, placing himself between Victoria and the shotgun. Run, he commanded, firing his revolver. In the same moment, Black pulled the trigger. The cabin filled with sound and fury, the deafening roar of the shotgun, the sharper crack of Mason's revolver, Victoria's cry of alarm. Mason staggered backward, blood blossoming across his left side, where several shotgun pellets had found their mark despite his attempt to dodge. Black advanced, discarding the shotgun for a revolver at his belt, his face contorted with triumph and rage. I've waited for this, Caldwell, he growled, ever since Gettysburg, ever since you survived the fire that should have ruined you. Mason straightened despite his wounds, keeping himself between Black and Victoria, who had not fled as ordered, but instead moved to a position where she could bring her own weapon to bear. It's over, Black, Mason stated, his voice steady despite the pain. Your men are outmatched outside. Sullivan's deputies will be here any moment. Then I'll complete what I came for before they arrive, Black replied, raising his revolver. Starting with the Harper woman while you watch. Then you'll join her. Victoria stepped forward, her own weapon aimed with unwavering precision at Black's chest. You failed before, she reminded him, her voice steady. You'll fail again. Black's attention shifted momentarily to Victoria, his expression revealing surprise at her composure, her defiance. It was the opening Mason needed. With speed belying his injuries, Mason charged forward, colliding with Black before the larger man could reorient his aim. They crashed into the wall, Black's revolver discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as Mason grappled for the control of the weapon. Despite his wounds, Mason fought with the desperation of a man protecting not just his own life, but something far more precious, the future he and Victoria had begun to build, the peace they had earned through suffering. Black, however, had the advantages of size, strength, and the energy of fanatical hatred. The struggle shifted across the cabin furniture, overturning both men, bleeding now, as Black's revolver remained the deadly prize in their contest. Victoria circled, seeking a clear shot, but the men moved too quickly, too chaotically for her to fire without risking Mason. With a powerful surge, Black slammed Mason against the stove, the impact momentarily stunning the wounded man. Black wrenched his arm free, the revolver now firmly in his control, and aimed it at Mason's head. "Die knowing you failed to protect her," he hissed, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that rang out wasn't from Black's weapon. Victoria had found her moment, her bullet striking Black's shoulder with enough force to spin him sideways, his own shot going wide. Before he could recover, Mason tackled him again, driving them both toward the open trapdoor in the floor. Together they tumbled into the darkness below, landing heavily on the earthen floor of the root cellar. The impact separated them momentarily, both men scrambling in the dimness for advantage, for weapons, for survival. Victoria appeared at the opening above, lamp in hand, illuminating the struggle below. In the sudden light, Mason spotted Black reaching for his fallen revolver. With desperate strength, Mason kicked the weapon away, sending it skittering into the shadows beyond the lamplight's reach. Black roared with frustration, abandoning the search for his gun in favor of direct attack. He charged Mason, his greater weight driving them both against the rough stone wall of the cellar. Mason felt ribs crack under the impact, pain flaring white-hot across his consciousness. "Mason," Victoria called from above, unable to safely fire into the confined space. "Stay back," Mason managed, ducking beneath Black's powerful but increasingly uncoordinated swings. The wound in Black's shoulder was taking its toll, his movements becoming sluggish as blood loss weakened him. Mason fought defensively now, conserving strength, allowing Black to exhaust himself through his own fury. It was a dangerous strategy. One powerful connection could end the fight instantly, but Mason's military experience and years of frontier survival had taught him the value of patience, even in desperate circumstances. Black's attacks grew wilder, his breathing labored, his movements betraying increasing weakness. Mason waited for his opportunity, then struck with focused precision a sharp blow to Black's wounded shoulder that drove the larger man to his knees with a howl of pain. In the lamplight from above, Mason could see the madness in Black's eyes, the realization that he was losing, that his vengeance was slipping away yet again. With a final surge of desperate strength, Black lunged forward, hands reaching for Mason's throat. Mason sidestepped, using Black's momentum against him, and delivered a powerful blow to the base of the skull. Black collapsed consciousness, fleeing body slack against the earthen floor. For a long moment, Mason stood over his fallen enemy, breathing heavily, blood seeping through his shirt from the shotgun wounds. Victory had come at considerable cost. "Mason," Victoria called, concern evident in her voice. "Are you all right?" He looked up at her silhouette framed in the lamplight, above the woman who had emerged from fire to stand beside him, who had found the courage to rebuild after devastating loss, who had just saved his life with a perfectly placed shot. "I will be," he answered truthfully. Sullivan appeared beside Victoria, peering down into the cellar. "Black's men are neutralized," he reported. 3 dead, 2 wounded, and captured. The 6th escaped into the forest, but he won't get far." "And Black?" Victoria asked, gesturing toward the motionless form at Mason's feet. Mason checked for a pulse, finding one weak but present. "Alive," he confirmed, "though I suspect he'll wish otherwise when he faces the hangman a second time." With Sullivan's help, they secured Black with rope from the cabin stores, his unconscious form offering no resistance. Mason climbed out of the cellar despite his injuries, refusing Victoria's suggestion that he rest, while Sullivan's men handled the prisoner. "I need to see this finished," he explained simply, and Victoria understood. Outside, the conflict had ended. The deputies were securing the surviving attackers, treating wounds where necessary, preparing for the journey back to town, where Black and his men would face justice once more. Mason stood on the porch watching as Black was loaded onto a wagon, still unconscious but securely bound. The night had fully descended, now stars emerging in the clear autumn sky above the Montana wilderness. Victoria joined him, her hand finding his uninjured side, offering support without drawing attention to his wounds. "It's truly over now," she said softly. Mason nodded, allowing himself to believe it for the first time. "Yes," he agreed. "Black will face a military tribunal for the guards he killed during his escape. There won't be a second chance for him to return." Victoria guided him gently back inside where his wounds could be properly treated. The cabin showed signs of the violent struggle, overturned furniture, bloodstains, the splintered remains of the back door, But these were merely physical damages, repairable with time and effort. What mattered was that they had survived, that the future they envisioned remained possible. Edward Harper's research was secure, his legacy preserved through his daughter's determination. The uranium deposits would be developed responsibly, their potential harnessed for the benefit of humanity as Harper had intended. And Mason and Victoria had discovered something neither had expected to find in the aftermath of tragedy, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared courage, and growing affection. A chance to heal old wounds, to build something new from the ashes of painful pasts. As Sullivan and his deputies departed with their prisoners, the night settled into peaceful quiet around the small cabin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, repairs to be made, wounds to be tended, the continuing work of rebuilding the Harper homestead. But tonight, in the aftermath of their final confrontation with Black Mason and Victoria, allowed themselves to simply exist in the moment of safety they had fought so hard to secure. The oil lamps burned low, casting gentle shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the Montana wilderness continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human conflicts and resolutions. "What happens now?" Victoria asked softly as she finished bandaging Mason's wounds. He considered her question, looking beyond the immediate future of recovery and rebuilding to the broader horizon of possibilities stretching before them. "We live," he answered simply. "We continue your father's work. We build something meaningful here." His blue eyes met hers, conveying what words alone could not express. "Together, if that's what you want." Victoria's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with natural ease. "It is," she confirmed, "very much." In that quiet moment of connection, the memories of fire and fear receded further into the past, not forgotten, but no longer defining. What remained, what grew stronger, was the bond forged through shared danger and mutual respect, a foundation for whatever future they would build together in this corner of the Montana wilderness. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, in their eternal dance, witnesses to the resilience of two souls who had each survived their own fires, only to find in each other the strength to begin anew.